object which could elicit this feeling of familiarity. So that's why Lyon thinks that there's no need to postulate the existence of a feeling of familiarity. We should rather focus on the way we behave. And he says that someone can look familiar, and we do not necessarily need to feel familiar with it. So his focus is in particular concentrated on the easiness of perception, on the fluency of perception, and the immediacy of our reaction, which is actually something I agree on. I agree on also because Wittgenstein himself in the Brown Book gives us a sort of hints about the impossibility to postulate and to define a unique feeling of familiarity. And what he does in the Brown Book is starting from the analysis of the feeling of familiarity and then trying to define it through the concept of similarity. So he makes a sort of analogy. And I think it's kind of interesting also if we think about what Lucy said yesterday about familiarity resembles familiarity, so not acquaintance familiarity. For example, Wittgenstein starts his reflection at page 127 of the Brown Book, and he writes, do we have a feeling of familiarity whenever we look at familiar objects, or do we have it usually? When do we actually have it? It helps us to ask, what do we contrast the feeling of familiarity with? One thing we contrast it with is surprise. One could say unfamiliarity is much more of an experience than familiarity. I think this passage is kind of interesting also because it presents unfamiliarity, as also Jérôme suggested yesterday, not as the lack of familiarity, but it's about a completely different experience. It's a different experience, according to Wittgenstein. And I think it is also kind of interesting because Wittgenstein presents here the problem of the exposure to stimuli. So the point is that when do we actually feel familiar with something? Every time we encounter a familiar object, for example, every time I just hold my old familiar cup, or just for the first time. So this is kind of problematic. And then in trying to define the feeling of familiarity, he started analyzing the feeling of similarity. And he writes then in the quote we are going to read right now, thus this experience, which is the experience of similarity, consists in having a peculiar feeling. I should have to say that it certainly isn't characterized by any such feeling alone. But the most important part of experience is that of letting my glance oscillate between the two objects, fixing it intently now on the one, now on the other, perhaps saying words of doubts, shaking my head, etc. There is, one might say, hardly any room left for a feeling of similarity between these manifold experiences. So this is kind of problematic because it seems that Wittgenstein explicitly refuses the idea of an existence of feeling of similarity, which is here connected by analogy to the feeling of familiarity. And he defines every single actions we do when we encounter an object we know as experiences. So he talks about manifold experiences and the way our body reacts to it. So this is true. It seems to be kind of impossible to define a feeling of familiarity or similarity. But, and this is why Lyons also proposes his kind of refusal of the postulation of the feeling of familiarity. But we are going to ask ourselves whether we could speak about a genuine contrast or not. Because in some passages actually of the Brown Book itself, which is, as you already know for sure, the preparation for the philosophical investigations. So what Wittgenstein writes in the Brown Book is then developed or presented in a much more like synthetic way and revisited way also in the philosophical investigations. For example, at page 129, Wittgenstein talks about um, some bodily responses related to the feeling of familiarity. He writes, for example, now, isn't it the feeling of relief just that which characterizes the experience of passing from unfamiliar to familiar things? So in a certain way, he does speaks about some kind of bodily reactions, some kind of bodily perceptions or um, responses when we encounter familiar objects or when we pass from unfamiliar to familiar things. And the point to discuss here, starting from Wittgenstein's account and from Lyon interpretation, but then also going on in our reflection, is actually what do we mean when we talk about a feeling? So Jerome gave us yesterday the definition of metacognitive feelings or epistemic feelings. Familiarity, for sure, can be interpreted as an epistemic feeling, as something which refers to the way we interact with the external world and which informs the subject in a certain way about the disruption in the experiential fluency. As also Jerome underlined yesterday, familiarity arises, and we were going to observe this aspect also later on, when we encounter something familiar in sort of unexpected context. So when familiarity is actually unexpected, when there's a sort of disruption in the expected and fluent proceeding of our experience. But at the same time, the feeling of familiarity cannot be defined uniquely as something cognitive, as Wittgenstein writes in this passage, but also as some phenomenological reflections provide us or tell us, familiarity is connected to a sort of feeling of warmth. We talked about it also yesterday, also with Lucy's talk, and which means basically being emotionally discharged from the tension elicited by unknown situations. There's a very nice paper wrote by Emanuele Caminada in 2014 when he write and there he writes about the role of joining the background for the development of habitual sentiments. So once the subject joins this common background with other subjects, then he or she feels at home and is emotionally discharged. There's no tension in the evolution, in the encounter with everyday experience. So the point is that we have to reflect about the opportunity or about the possibility of talking about a mixed account of familiarity. So are we really talking about a single distinctive and conscious affective states? I was very struck by Lyon's idea that we can just talk about easiness of perception and a conscious judgment of familiarity. So I think it's kind of a reduced way of observing this concept, just connecting it to the arisal, to the development of a conscious judgment about familiarity. And above all, do we really need to dismiss the role of a feeling of familiarity if we focus, as Lyon does, on the perceptual fluencies or on the manifold experiences which characterize our relationship with the environment, as also Wittgenstein does? There's a bunch of literature talking about a sort of mixed account of familiarity, and I think we could apply this kind of reading of this concept also to Wittgenstein's account. For example, according to Arango Munoz's, epistemic feelings themselves can be said to be embodied, and we can discuss about it also later on if you want. And Wittgenstein stresses in the passage from the Brown Book, but also in other passages about the bodily response of our the bodily response we show in our everyday experience. Or, for example, Thomas Fuchs in Phenomenology underlines that Vertrautheit, so familiarity, is a precondition for the same life worth sharing. So, for this join in the background I introduced before, but it is also reflected in the way we behave. So, to feel familiar does not mean to elicit necessarily a specific feeling and or judgment. It means in a certain way to behave in the environment in a certain way, and we are going to see how. So what I want to propose to you right now is a sort of granular understanding of familiarity or atomic understanding of familiarity. So if you keep in mind the bedrock and the river picture we are going to analyze now with with a quote, I think familiarity can be understood as a kind of, yeah, fragile but really atomic concept. And here is where Wittgenstein proposes the idea of the bedrock in the river, and this quote taken from Uncertainty, paragraphs 95, 97. I just merged all the paragraph in one single quote. He writes, the propositions describing these word pictures might be part of a kind of mythology, and their role is like that of rules of a game. And the game can be learned purely practically, without learning any explicit rules. It might be imagined that some propositions of the form of empirical propositions were hardened and functioned as channels for such empirical propositions as were not hardened but fluid, and that this relation altered with time, in that fluid propositions hardened and hard ones became fluid. The mythology may change back into a state of flux, the riverbed of thoughts may shift. But I distinguish between the movement of the waters on the riverbed and the shift of the bed itself, though there is not a sharp division of the one from the other. So, what Wittgenstein is discussing in this quote is the role of what he calls hinges propositions. So those kind of basic certainties we all have in order to share the same life world, we can say. Please forgive me this kind of um, mixed lexical I'm using it here at this place. So basically, those kind of hinge propositions, those basic certainties, build our mythology. So build our background set of beliefs, uses, traditions. So everything we have, costumes, and so on. But at the same time, they're not fixed, they are dynamical, they evolve with the practices themselves. And familiarity as a core element of those basic certainties belongs to the bedrock and constitutes it. So that's why he's like the sand. That's why I really like this idea of a granular concept. So it's really like the sand building up all the layers, but at the same time, it develops together with the river. So it's the core of our form of life, but at the same time, it evolves with it. And it reflects in the way we act every day. At the same time, when familiarity as a feeling emerges only in the cases when we encounter a sort of fruitful disruption. So when we encounter the inconceivable, the something unheard of, as Wittgenstein describes it, and as also the discrepancy attribution hypothesis, for example, in psychology, underlines in connection to familiarity. So basically, if we want to jump to some provisional conclusions, familiarity can be understood starting from Wittgenstein as a tracing element, which represents the core of our everyday practices following at the same time their development. It guides our relationship with the world, embracing the basic certainties which allow a fluent experience with our environment. As a feeling, and we don't need to dismiss the role of a feeling of familiarity, in my view, because as a feeling, it can emerge. It doesn't necessarily have to emerge in its mixed nature, which is also, so not only a cognitive, but also a bodily and embodied nature, thanks to the moments of disruption when the bedrock and the river mutually modify each other. As Lyon underlines, it is of course difficult to isolate it as a specific and unique feeling, but we don't have to dismiss it. It is at the same time felt by the subject in the way she interacts with the world. And please keep in mind this in, because I think it will be very useful to jump to our part two. And as this basic tracing element, familiarity, in my view, is what allows agreement. And with the concept of agreement, we can just move to part two, which is actually shorter than part one. And I would start this part two with this quote taken from the Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 241, where we read, "So you are saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false. It is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language they use. That is not an agreement in opinions, but in forms of life." Sorry, in form of life. So this is actually a very famous quote from the Philosophical Investigation, and a lot of research right now, still nowadays, is trying to understand, first of all, to what extent, so how can we understand this notion of form of life in Wittgenstein? Is highly disputed also right now. And the second thing, which is still highly disputed, is how we should understand this agreement in opinions, not in opinions, but in forms of life. So before investigating the notion of agreement, I just want very briefly and roughly give you an overview of the way the notion of form of life has been interpreted by some critique. So the first common way of interpreting it is as so equals to language game. So form of life equal language game. And because Wittgenstein in paragraph 19 of the Philosophical Investigations writes to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. So some interpreters just thought, okay, our form of life is just equals the bunch of language games we use and we master, and equals our language. So each language with different language games represents a different form of life. This is true on the one hand. On the other, it doesn't look at the sort of what I call the biological interpretation of form of life, because of course Wittgenstein talks also about a sort of human form of life, so a unitary account of form of life. And it is present above all in Philosophy of Psychology, paragraph 1, when he opposes the human form of life to the animal one, discussing, for example, the phenomenon of hope. He says an animal cannot hope because it doesn't it doesn't belong to our form of life. And it is also connected to the very famous quote, "If a lion could speak, we would not understand him because it belongs to a completely different form of life." So to the animal form of life, not the human one. This is also a kind of complicated and disputed way of interpreting it, because it's in a certain way equals Wittgenstein, or it attributes to Wittgenstein a sort of naturalistic account, which I don't think really fits his philosophy, and we will see why afterwards. And the third way of interpreting the notion of form of life is generally connected to set of rules, criteria, and norms we use to master our language game. And so as a normative concept, basically. And this is, for example, an account that Augier sustains, but also other philosophers, because of course, if you're talking about a language game, that we need some rules in order to master it. So I think those three different ways of interpreting the notion of formal life are all correct in a certain way, but they have to be integrated one to another. So they cannot be observed in isolation, because we should actually try to understand what does Wittgenstein mean when he talks about agreement. I think the way, the key to, to understand correctly the notion of form of life is strictly connected to the notion of agreement. So if we understand the notion of agreement as explicit consensus, then this quote means that we consciously and we autonomously decide to agree in our form of life. So it's something the subject makes in autonomy, and yeah, it just decides to do it. I don't think this is the correct way to interpret it. Mm, and it is also connected to, in a certain way, Kripke's interpretation of the notion of agreement in his famous book, Wittgenstein's Rule in Private Language of 1984. He says that in order to solve the paradox, as it is famous, of interpretation, so the way that basically every interpretation of the rule can be coherent with the execution of this rule, we have to focus on the notion of agreement. So in his way, in his interpretation, um, the concept of agreement represents the foundation and the paradigmatic concept we have for the setting up of rules. This is undoubtedly correct, but the risk is that we attribute the notion of foundation, so a sort of foundational role to the concept of agreement. So if we say that the agreement is what allows the setting up of rules and is the core of our form of life, then of course we pinpoint in it a sort of foundation. And Wittgenstein, in my view and in my reading, proposes much more a groundless account of forms of life, as we will see. So, and is not looking for foundations or ultimate foundations of his concepts. I think the best way to understand the notion of agreement is given by some interpreters belonging to the so-called Avronstrol school. Um, and in this sort of school, they focus much more, those interpreters focus much more on the later Wittgenstein, and they um, see in uncertainty the third big work of Wittgenstein, and focusing on uncertainty, interpreters like Moyal Sharrock, for example, underlines the fact that when we talk about agreement in Wittgenstein's philosophy, we should really focus on the way we behave instinctively. And the this stressing out the notion of instinct, I think it's kind of legitimate, because Wittgenstein himself talks about something animal. In paragraphs 358, 359, we read, "Now I would like to regard this certainty," so those kind of hinges propositions building up our mythology, as we have seen before, not as a something akin to hastiness or superficiality. So it's not something we have to passively accept without reflecting about it as something imposed from the outside on us, but as a form of life that is very badly expressed and probably badly thought as well. But that means I want to conceive it as something that lies beyond being justified or unjustified, as it were, as something animal. So those certainties are actually our form of life, and they are observed and proposed as something animal, so something which really belongs to us, uh, beyond being justified or unjustified, and they are so strictly connected to a precise way of acting and reacting to the environment. So if we accept this kind of reading, so if we focus more on the concept of agreement as connected to the way we act and react, then we can accept the thing that practices constitute our form of life. They give form to the form. Please forgive this kind of wordplay I'm proposing it now. And this form of life consists basically in what we do. And this is what I call the sort of transcendental interpretation of forms of life in my work. And I think this focus on practice and on the primacy of action can be also observed in this passage, which is also a very famous and quoted one, when we read the word language game is used here to emphasize the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity or a form of life. So if we go back to our different interpretations of form of life, and if we focus on the first one, so form of life equals language game, it is true that the notion of language game and form of life are strictly interconnected one to another, but they're not the same. They're not equivalent. Um, Language game, so speaking a language, is part of an activity or a form of life. Form of life is the activity or is the bunches of activities which legitimate, so to say, in their development, the general active framework we are immersed in. And without those practices, forms of life could not emerge, could not come to light. So we could not imagine the concept of form of life without practices. So once again, it is not something we receive from the outside. It is not something imposed on us, but it's something we create and we modify with our practices. So basically, this is so the core of my reading of Wittgenstein. Forms of life emerge together with the practices, and practices themselves give rise to forms. They are essentially acted and enacted. But now there's a problem, of course, and it's connected also to the fact that I said before, we cannot isolate a foundational element in Wittgenstein's philosophy. Forms of life are said to be groundless in Wittgenstein's account. Doesn't mean they are arbitrary. So the fact that Wittgenstein doesn't want to isolate or postulate a foundational element in his thought, does it mean that the concept of form of life is a sort of arbitrary one? Well, I don't think so. Uh, yeah, I don't think so, because if we recall what we said about familiarity before, so in our part one, so to say, the familiar traces, the familiar atomic granular traces, guide the development of our practices. Sorry, there's an S more in guide. They guide the development of our practices. And with it, the constitution of forms of life themselves. So that's why they are not arbitrary, and their groundlessness lies in their performative nature. So in the fact that they just emerge together with the practices, but they're not arbitrary one. They are, of course, disciplinate from those familiar traces, though dynamic. So they are not fixed, they are not strictly normalized, I would say, crystallized, but at the same time, they are disciplinate, so to say. And this trace, this familiar trace, is reflected in the way we behave and emerges, as we said before, in the moments of disruptions. We actually formulate conscious judgments about familiar experience when we encounter discrepancy. So we do it, but it's not something we always do. It's just in those moments of disruptions that we may or can formulate conscious judgments about familiarity. It's also not something that, as Lyon says, we always do. And this kind of discrepancy could also be observed really in the way other, so to say, components of our human form of life behave. For example, if we look at this quote from the Philosophical Investigation, paragraph 200, Wittgenstein is describing here some people playing chessboard in an unfamiliar way. And he writes, it is, of course, imaginable that two people belonging to a tribe unacquainted with games should sit at a chessboard and go through the moves of a game of chess, and even with all the appropriate mental accompaniments. But now imagine a game of chess translated according to certain rules into a series of actions which we do not ordinarily associate with a game, say into yells and stamping of feet. And now suppose those two people to yell and stamp instead of playing the form of chess that we are used to. and this in a such way that the procedure is translatable by suitable rules into a game of chess. Should we still be inclined to say they were playing a game? What right would one have to say so? So the point is that if we observe that something is unfamiliar for us in the way of acting and behaving, can we still say that we share the same basic certainties, the same basic hinges? Of course we do, but those kind of basic hinges, those kind of certainties, basic certainties building up our mythology, modify with the way we behave so we can create new domains of familiar practices, building our form of life and modifying our form of life. So the agreement in forms of life and in the way we behave means to belong to the same bedrock river constellation and means acting through the grains and following the grains of familiar traces, modifying with our practices the sedimented layers. So I think that now we can just wrap up some conclusions. I think we are perfectly on time. Okay. So basically, I hope it is clear what I'm trying to propose here. So questioning the role of familiarity, we understood it as a granular element or atomic element playing the tracing role of our experiences. And in doing this, of course, its precarious and all-encompassing nature makes a unique and precise definition of it almost impossible. So this is something we also have to accept. I don't think we really need to give a unique definition of familiarity. It represents the core of the practices constituting and legitimating our form of life, and at the same time changes with their evolution. And I want also to discuss you this kind of legitimation of forms, because I think that forms of life in general represent in Wittgenstein the natural evolution of the concept of form in general as presented in the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein writes that the form is the possibility of structure. So this potential meaning of the notion of form represent the different way it can make the forms can make the structure possible with their evolution and can legitimate the structure they are in. So forms of life in their transcendental interpretation emerge performatively with practices following the familiar trace given by the bedrock. Concurrently, they allow for the emergence of new levels of familiarity since they modify the bedrock itself. Both familiarity and forms of life become object of self-reflection in connection with the dimension of the uncanny, inconceivable, or disruption or discrepancy, if you want to call them this way. But it is important to underline this point. Disruption does not represent an obstacle, but the possibility of redefinition and transformation of everyday practices. So, and with it, I just thank you for your attention and yeah, looking forward for the discussion. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Sonia, for this very clear and insightful talk and presentation. And we have now more or less 10 minutes for discussion. So I just open the discussion, and I see Jerome and Eric. So Jerome, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, that was very, very interesting. I was wondering if, I mean, part of what you said might be turned into a criticism of the very idea that there are feelings of familiarity instead of feelings of unfamiliarity. And one of the quotations by Wittgenstein that you've shown, I mean, suggests an asymmetry between familiarity and unfamiliarity in this respect. So I was wondering whether, for instance, what we call the feeling of unexpected familiarity. I mean, you mentioned Whittlesey and Williams' work on the relationship between expectations. I mean, expected familiarity. And their view is that the feeling of familiarity is really a function between observed fluency and expected fluency. And so, for instance, if I see Francesca now, I don't have a feeling of familiarity because I expected to see her this morning. Of course, she's familiar to me, but I don't have a feeling about the familiarity. Whereas if I'm in an exotic place and I see someone familiar to me in an unfamiliar place, then I might have a feeling of familiarity. So I was wondering really whether, the feeling of unexpected familiarity is not really a feeling of unfamiliarity, actually. The feeling that something is wrong and the feeling that there is some disruption in some hinge proposition. Something that was taken for granted becomes an empirical matter, something that must be empirically a change of status, if you wish, between a hinge proposition and an empirical proposition with the same content, in some sense of content. So that would be the death of the notion of feeling of familiarity and a plea for its replacement by the notion of the feeling of unfamiliarity. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question, which is actually one of the problems I'm struggling with since I'm studying the sense of familiarity in general and the feeling of familiarity related to it. And I had actually 2 days ago an exchange with my new housemate, and she asked me what I was working on, because I was just preparing this talk. And I just told her about the feeling of familiarity and the unexpected familiarity, and she was very curious about it. And what I found also very interesting is that I made the same examples that you did. Like, if you meet your boyfriend at home, then you feel familiar. You don't feel really familiar with him, but if you meet him at work, you don't expect to meet him at work. So a stronger feeling of familiarity emerges. And she told me, well, actually, I would feel so weird and I wouldn't have to do anything with him. So, I would reject him in this context. And I was like, okay, good. So what does it mean that a feeling of unexpected familiarity arises then in this concept? Because our instinctive answer were like, okay, no, if I meet my boyfriend at work, I just don't want to have anything to do with him. I just want to push him away because he doesn't belong to this environment. And this reaction was actually, it gave me a lot of food for thought, because I thought like, okay, so maybe what we call feeling of familiarity, of unexpected familiarity, is actually a feeling of weirdness, or we feel, of course, this person belongs to us, or with our private life and environment, but we don't want to have it in this sphere or in this kind of context. So, well, I actually don't know. I don't have a unique answer to your question. It is for sure the fact that, it is for sure the case that it is easier for me to understand the existence of a feeling of unfamiliarity rather than a feeling of familiarity in this framework. But at the same time, as I said before, there is something felt, also bodily felt, when we pass from unfamiliar to familiar thing, but it's something that occurs in the passage. So what I'm interested in is the passage from unfamiliar to familiar context. So I'm going to focus specifically on this kind of passage. So it has to do also with stimuli exposure. I think that also Francesca will talk about it in her talk, so about how long and for how long we are exposed to a stimulus. And now we just take it for granted and we don't feel familiar with it anymore. So thanks for this kind of suggestion, Jerome. I think I will concentrate a little bit more about it, because it can be very interesting to develop these reflections in those directions. So to postulate a feeling of unfamiliarity instead of familiarity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks, Jerome. And now, Eric, I think, had a question. So, Eric, please.
Yeah, try to keep it short. It was in the middle section of your talk when you mentioned like the interpretation of Fuchs from Wittgenstein and Husserl, connect them both of them, and then the different kinds of interpretation of Wittgenstein. I have to think of Aristotle and his concept of practice, as foundation for habits. And it's not by accident that this concept is emerging in the Nicomachean Ethics. So a reflection on sociality. So the sociality is the input for practice, i.e. forms of life, and what I would say homeworlds. So my attempt would be to compare the concept of forms of life and homeworld as a more precise version of the life world theory, which includes norms, language, cultures, behaviors, and so on and so forth. It's a really an umbrella term, but I think it matches quite well with Wittgenstein. I would love to hear what you think.
Thank you, Eric. It's actually what I tried to do in my dissertation. So this is precisely what I was trying to do in my dissertation. And your dissertation was also very useful for my work. I read it and was really insightful about the first Lebensweltphilosophie in Husserl. So your idea was exactly what I was trying to develop in my dissertation. So I hope I did it. Of course, I just wanted to concentrate on one aspect of my work today because of time constraints. So I just decided to concentrate more on Wittgenstein than on Husserl, also because it opens a lot of other questions and problems we have to solve also about the connection between and the legitimation of a connection between Husserl and Wittgenstein. So it wouldn't be kind of complicated to talk about it. But yeah, I completely agree with you. And yeah, I let you know if I manage to do it in my PhD work. Then I'm waiting for the discussion and then of my work for the Verteidigung, and then I let you know. But yeah, thank you, because it really, I mean, it's good to hear it, because it means that it makes sense what I did, because you also had the same idea. So very nice, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to it. Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Francesca now, and also a question.
I think that Lilian was before me.
Okay, sorry. Then Lilian first, and then Francesca. So I missed the order. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Sonia. That was so interesting. I really liked the image you used with the river and the bedrock, and that allowed you to include this idea of modification and kind of a gradual change. And you suggested that practices can initiate this change, right? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you think that these changes can also happen kind of from the outside, that the individual is acted upon. And like, I'm coming from the trauma corner, right? So I think that in traumatic experiences, there is this element of being acted upon and the loss of control that's actually very severely changing how we perceive the world. So I think I was wondering if you think that this could somehow be combined and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very nice problem. I mean, an important problem that you touch. I think we should distinguish here between I mean, this is a huge problem, and we talked about it also yesterday, because sometimes we look for general structures or general concepts, missing the huge role and the importance of single cases. And so what you call a trauma could happen mostly, I think, at an individual scale and not a collective scale. But at the same time, if we, for example, think about the notion of transformative experience that Carel just developed in the last months, then of course pandemic is a transformative experience. It's something that is modifying our form of life, but it's something that came from the outside. So it's not something that we consciously tried to act. But I mean, I just wanted to underline the role of practices themselves without specifying their origin. So without specifying the conscious or the autonomous origin of those practices. So of course, a traumatic experience or a transformative experience coming from the outside can modify our way of acting. For example, the pandemic, the fact that we do not shake hands anymore, we just give elbows, but we internalize those kind of practices from the outside, but then this kind of internalization will modify, so to say, our form of life. Yes, so of course they can be both integrated, I think, if we don't strictly focus on a specific origin, but if we look at both sides. So thank you for that. It's important. I will integrate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Now it's Francesca's turn, so please.
Yes, thanks a lot, Sonia. Maybe we can keep also the discussion for later, because I will come back to some of your points. But just one thing, because you talk a lot about familiarity, and I wanted to understand whether you think that there is also a point for togetherness, in the sense that when do you think that it's worth to share this, how to say, this change? Is it always the case to articulate and share it with the others and make parts of these dynamics, or not?
Yeah, that's also a very good point. Thank you, Francesca, for that. And it also connects to what we said yesterday about those kind of self-transcendent experiences that Jerome proposed, that they are like solitary, mostly solitary experience, but have a kind of pro-social role. Well, I think it has to do with the difficulty of wordly articulation of some experiences we have, but sometimes this kind of sharing happens maybe also if we don't want to. So in the mere acting and reacting, then we show our response to those kind of instincts. And so we communicate also in actions and in the way we react, the fact that we are trying to pursue a change in the practice. So I cannot really answer the question about when it is worth to do it, or maybe I should focus, if we want to develop this kind of concept, I should then differentiate or observe different cases in which we can actively share those kind of changes with other, and we cannot, and we can articulate those changes and not. But yeah, so it's something I have to work in, actually, because I didn't differentiate about those kind of different experiences. But yeah, thank you, Francesca.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sonia. We have actually one last question, which was written in the chat.
In the chat.
So I can read it. It's by Professor Fabio Gligenti, who has a problem with the microphone. So I will read it. So you exclude the role of rules, see Kripke. You interpret the form of life as founded on instinct, but how we can think of forms, practices, without regularity, without an algorithm that guarantees us the continuity and discontinuity of the processes. So.
Thank you, Professor Grigenti. This is, I think, a very important point. And I mean, I tried to show, but maybe I just have to go a little bit more into depth in this to this point, that there is a form of regularity. I mean, I told about the guiding role of this granular concept of familiarity. So of course, familiarity in its atomic form guides our experiences. So there is a sort of disciplinate evolution of the form of life with our practices. So it's not that everything is arbitrary and we can do whatever we want. There is a sort of discipline. So that's why I use the image of the bedrock in the river. But at the same time, the relationship between the bedrock and the river is dynamic. So there is a sort of algorithm, if you want to call it, but it's not a normalized, a crystallized one. It's a dynamical one. Of course, regularities and rules are essential. Otherwise, we could not communicate and we could not share the same life world as, for example, also Fuchs writes. right? But they are sort of regularities which accompany our practices. They do not impose on themselves on the practices strictly, in my view. But then, of course, there are multiple interpretations of Wittgenstein's philosophy, so we can discuss about it if you want also later on.
Okay, thank you. I think there was another question by Marco Borcelli. Yes, maybe if you can be very quick, because
yes, I will be very quick.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for your presentation. It was wonderful. And just wondering, as Aristotle names came out in the discussion after your talk, Aristotle, the Nicomacheanetics.
Aristotle, yeah, sorry, I can't hear you well.
And as I was saying yesterday, I come from different quarters. And, you know, Aristotle's my philosophical hero, basically, and his medieval commentators. Can you hear me?
No, actually, I can't.
No.
I don't know if the others have the same problem with the audio. You can hear Marco well, okay. So
Can you hear me? Yeah.
no, you can't. Okay, so
No, you
everyone
can't.
has the same problem. Okay,
Uh,
better now.
I was just wondering if in Wittgenstein there is an influence of Aristotle's theory of habit and practice, because I think it was Wittgenstein who said that he took pride in not reading ancient philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, because Wittgenstein didn't refer to any of his of other philosophers in his writings. I mean, it happens very rarely, and I think he just explicitly refers to Russell and Frege. Yeah, so I don't know. It can be, but I don't know. I'm not sure about it. I don't think that Wittgenstein read ancient philosophy. He wasn't interested in history of philosophy at all, and I think that ancient philosophy wasn't actually at the center of his interest. So I cannot answer actually this question. There is, of course, a lot of research about the influences on Wittgenstein's philosophy, because it's unclear which kind of references he has. But explicitly about Aristotle, I don't know. I don't think so, I have to say, because, as I said, he wasn't interested in ancient philosophy at all.
I was wondering because Aristotle's name came up like when the speakers just mentioned the Nicomacheanetics before. So
Yeah,
maybe
no, you're right. Yeah,
there could be a paradigm, an Aristotelian paradigm, just influencing, maybe also unconsciously, Wittgenstein theory of the practices. It could be, I don't know.
I could search a little bit more about it, but I haven't encountered any kind of secondary literature talking about it. But of course, I can make a little bit more research about it. Yeah, thank you, Marco.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank for the great questions. I think we can now go to our second talk. So we will have a talk by Francesca Herbas, who is a professor in philosophy of language at the University of Cagliari and fellow at the NIAS of Amsterdam. Her research topics include translation theory, experimental pragmatics, argumentation theory, and metaphor and irony comprehension. The title of her talk is Feeling the Extraordinary in Ordinary Language, Familiarity and Linguistic Intimacy. So thank you very much, Francesca, and you have the word.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I don't have the permission to share my screen, so I think you have to give me the permission.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay, now you should be able to share the screen.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, so maybe like that. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your invitation. I'm really happy to be here at board with you and discuss this same topic on familiarity and togetherness. I'm not going to talk about togetherness, but I think that there's something similar that can be room for discussion in the similarities between togetherness and linguistic intimacy. So just an outline of my presentation. So I will first present to introduce the concept of linguistic intimacy and how it was presented in metaphor theory. And I will ask whether it is common for all linguistic phenomena, and I will say no, there are some specific phenomena for which we have linguistic intimacy, even though there are also differences between these different linguistic phenomena. And I will ask whether is it an effect of linguistic familiarity? And I will ask where, well, not exactly with an effect of familiarity. There's some relation with familiarity, but it's not an effect of linguistic familiarity. And then I will try to underpin my thesis, that also the thesis that I would like to propose for the method issue. So I would very like to discuss with you this proposal because it's in its infancy. Well, the idea is that linguistic intimacy is an effective meeting point when we are invited to see unfamiliar aspects in ordinary language. And I put unfamiliar in this way, exactly because of Sonia and Jérôme's question about the relationship between the feeling of familiarity and unfamiliarity, or the unfamiliarity that becomes familiar. And then I will try to draw some conclusion. So first of all, what is linguistic intimacy? This term was introduced by Ted Cohen in Metaphor and the Cultivation of Intimacy. And he suggests that there's a point in metaphor, which is independent of the question of its cognitivity and which has nothing to do with its aesthetical character. I think that there is something to do with cognitive and also aesthetic character, but I was interested in Ted Cohen's proposal because says that the point in a metaphor is the achievement of intimacy. And he defines intimacy as the way in which the maker and the appreciator of a metaphor are drawn closer to one another. And he sets three conditions for linguistic intimacy: that the speaker issues a kind of concealed invitation, that the hearer expends a special effort to accept the invitation, and this transaction constitutes the acknowledgement of a community. Well, according to Cohen, all three conditions are involved in any communication, but in ordinary literal discourse, the involvement is so pervasive and routine that they go unremarked. Even though also most metaphors go unremarked, I would say that there will be different levels of familiarity in metaphor, and there are many familiar metaphors that go unremarked as well as literal discourse. Instead, the use of metaphors, according to Cohen, throw them into a relief. There's a kind of point of relief, and there is a point in that for metaphor, for using metaphors. But in Cohen's point of view, there's other linguistic phenomena that can give us this sense, this feeling of linguistic intimacy. Not only metaphor, humor, for instance, make people feel this kind of intimacy when it works. And in these cases, people actively engage one another in coping with a piece of language that also requires information about one another's knowledge, belief, intentions, attitudes to be grasped. Quoting Cohen, he said that the other person must penetrate our humorous remark, so to speak, in order to explore you yourself, in order to grasp the import, for that import is not exactly in the remark itself. Furthermore, you know that he's in doing this. You have invited him to do it. You have in fact required him to do it. He accepts the requirement, and you two become an intimate pair. So there are some similarity with metaphors because there is this invitation, but I will claim that there's a lot of distinction between the two phenomena. And especially in metaphor, we have another kind of experience when compared to humor. There's the experience of aspect seeing. So is intimacy defined in positive terms? Because we could say, why not irony or sarcasm? Why don't we feel this kind of linguistic intimacy in irony, or when we use irony or sarcasm? And I think the reason is that both require a negative attitude toward the target. Usually irony has this specific dissociative attitude toward a situation in case of irony, or even toward a person in the case of the designated victim of sarcasm. While linguistic intimacy sounds as a positive attitude. However, when we look at the definition in Ted Cohen, it says that intimacy indeed sounds like a good thing. And I have been urging attention to the use of metaphor in its cultivation. It is not, however, an invariable friendly thing, nor is it intended to be. Sometimes one draws near one another in order to deal a penetrating trust. When the device is a style metaphor or a cruel joke requiring much background and effort to understand, it is all the more painful because the victim has been made a complicitor in his own demise. Do not therefore suppose that jokes are always for sheer amusement or metaphor always for communal insight. Some of the most instructive examples will be ones in which intimacy is sought as a means to a lethal and one-sided effect. Then Cohen ends up here with the definition of linguistic intimacy and left room for further research. So here we are. Well, in a sense, we can say that however, the affective incoherence might be precisely the reason why people suppress sarcastic irony. And for instance, children grasp it later. And this is the conclusion I will try to draw in this talk. So is it an effect, the second question, is it an effect of linguistic familiarity? We don't have so many experimental study about linguistic intimacy. We have a lot, of course, about familiarity and linguistic familiarity, but we don't have so much about linguistic intimacy. We have two studies by Horton that try to test Cohen's claim that a feeling of intimacy between speakers and addressees are created through their mutual understanding of particular figurative expression. And in one study, say that participants judge some story characters, the stories that were asked to read, as more familiar to each other when their interactions contain metaphoric utterances, but in the sense that they know each other. And another studies where participants were as fast to read metaphoric utterances as literal in the context of familiar relationship, but were slower to read metaphoric utterances in the context of unfamiliar relationship. And this pattern was especially strong for novel metaphor, completely new metaphor, creative uses of metaphor, of language. But Horton interpreted the result as a strategy to avoid the social risky behavior. So in case of unfamiliar relationship, we don't produce metaphor because it's too risky and we might be misunderstood. But I think that the experimental design does not tell us very much on the feeling of intimacy. We are just attributing to other two characters talking with each other, whether they know each other. And I will try to show that there is a kind of difference, another language game, to know and to feel. Another experiment, the most recent one by Bose and Katz, showed that the reading metaphor enhanced the performance on the reading in the mind in the eyes test. That's the test that are widely used to measure the theory of mind, but it is used also to understand the ability to perceive emotions, even though the potential links with more complex affective emotional abilities, as for instance in the case of the feeling of intimacy, remain unclear. But interestingly, in these studies, metaphor, but not literal counterparts, were associated with fictive contexts that contain reference to mental states with emotional contact. We're associated with a sense of intimacy between interlocutors via the presence of affective words. So I don't want to add more senses of familiarity because we explore a lot of senses, but even in philosophy of language, in experimental pragmatics, and linguistics, we have a lot of meaning of familiarity. And familiarity can be said in many ways. And usually we test the familiarity of meaning, the extent to which participants feel familiar with the meaning of a stimulus. For instance, elephant is very familiar in terms of meaning, but not in terms of experience. I think I saw an elephant maybe just twice in a life. Familiarity can be also a subjective frequency. Something, a stimulus can be salient in the mental lexicon of a single person, the subjective frequency with which the participants encounter the stimulus. Familiarity has also been interpreted as conventionality, the extent to which the figurative meaning is conventional in a linguistic community, and thus it suffers from an overuse and becomes lexicalized in the dictionary. Familiarity of experience is the extent to which participants experience the stimulus and can be different from the familiarity of meaning and also the conventionality. For instance, the lawyers are sharks is a highly conventional metaphor, but it's very low in familiarity of experience. I never see a shark, but I always encounter metaphor as a lot of time lawyers or shark are sharks. There are other metaphors, the novel one, as for instance, woman is a Venice glass, which is put together for the first time and just for once in a text in the 16th century. But, you know, I know very well, so I have the experience with Venice glass, but I'm not familiar with the meaning of this metaphor. And then, and that's what I would like to explore, there's a spectral familiarity, the extent to which I see something as something else. I notice an aspect. And this is the definition of familiarity introduced by Esther, but talking with just about poetic metaphors. What I would like to do here is that this is not specific to poetic metaphor, but it can be done in ordinary language, not just for poetry. In the philosophical grammar, Wittgenstein introduced the experience of familiarity as the becoming aware of a difference in how someone appears to ourselves. Someone meets me in the street and my eyes are drawn to his face. Perhaps I ask myself, who is that? Suddenly the face begins to look different in a particular way. And in this, the word that Wittgenstein uses, aspect, say it becomes familiar to me. It's something that concerns the becoming familiar. I smile, go up to him and greet him by name. So Wittgenstein used this word aspect to refer to this immediate experience of an object that appears to ourselves as different from how it usually appears. Call it the dawning of an aspect, which is not confined just to visual experience. For instance, Wittgenstein talked about also aspects hearing. We can hear something that sounds different, the same song, but in another context that have another aspect for me. And refers to the phenomenological objects, to the appearance of an object in this and that specific way in the flow of experience. So in this trend of metaphor studies from Aldrich, Hester, and on, metaphor is linked to the Wittgenstein aspect seeing in aesthetic perception. The concept of an aspect is akin to the concept of an image, or in other words, the concept I am now seeing it as is akin to I now having this image. And the aspect has this peculiar status. It is as if an image came into contact and for a time remained in contact with visual impression, concluding that aspect C is half visual experience. So I'm referring to Wittgenstein here, the second part of the philosophical investigation. So this trend of studies connect the metaphor to the experience of aspect seeing as it is described in the second part of the philosophical investigation. And this sense is seen an aspect is specific of poetic metaphor for them as a linguistic phenomenon. A metaphor is dual in that it has something to do with the meaning of words, but at the same time with an image in their image exhibiting mode. So in metaphor theory, there has been really a heated debate between the view that metaphor is conceptual in nature, especially with Lakoff and Johnson's famous text, and the view that on the other side, metaphor is an image. It's not really, it concerns the literal meaning because we cannot really, an image cannot be expressed with words. And this is the position of Donald Davidson. But up until now, the conceptual view dominated, also guiding empirical research. So we have a lot of studies about testing the conceptual theory of metaphor, but less about the imagistic theory of metaphor. So the interpretation of metaphors in this framework evoke mental images and then produce perception-like experience. And the recent accounts claim that in some cases, speakers might linger in literal meaning of metaphors and evoke mental images, which might prompt new implication, additional non-propositional cognitive effect. In this, putting together two different domains that are connected together, there's a semantic distance. And metaphor is the way to fill in this semantic distance by applying the property of a domain to another, but in the connection, in the interaction of the two domain, some relevant property might be emergent, could emerge from this interaction. From seeing one thing in terms of another, there could be some emergent properties that was not expected, nor from a domain, nor from the other. This might be linked to conceptual combination of the two domains or to the images evoked. So for instance, Carsten talked about two routes to metaphor understanding, one in which the image is permitted, but it's quite accidental. For instance, the table legs, it's a conventional metaphor. We don't really need to imagine the leg of a human being in order to understand the table legs. While in other cases, especially with novel metaphor, but I will put in question this point, we have image demanding metaphor. For instance, in the case of the cielo di perla in Pascoli, pearl sky, where we are, the metaphor itself demands an image in order to be fully understood. So metaphor is kind of a picturing function. The hearer might discover features we used to ignore. Sometimes they're discovering new feature in the target amounts to really create them in that moment via mental imagery. A metaphor can feed mental imagery in a lot of way, and that was many authors points these or highlight these properties of this function, picturing function of metaphor can provide a concept with an image, suggest direction in which to look, can change the perspective, evoke perceptual feature, and then alter our possibilities of thinking. This is not new. Previously, we mentioned Aristotle. Maybe it was the first that kept together both the conceptual and the imagistic theory of metaphor when they say that metaphor sets the scene before our eyes. So a metaphor points out, shows, makes us see an aspect. But differently from other linguistic phenomena, metaphor can be an invitation to see something else in ordinary language, and not just poems. So the idea is that metaphor has this structure that we see something else, and this is the main distinction with humor that Cohen missed. Take, for instance, this example. One morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got into my pajamas, I'll never know. This is by Groucho Marx. we read the sentence in a sense. There's of course a syntactic ambiguity. I read my pajamas, that attributing that to the subject and not to the elephant, to the object. But then in the second sentence, I highlight the second unfamiliar reading, what is not salient, not the salient reading, how he got into my pajamas. I'll never know, because we don't expect that an elephant can wear a pajamas. You know, that's kind of feeling of intimacy, because we have these, we can have intimacy there, feeling of intimacy, but not because there's a structure of see something as something else, and in the case of metaphor, but because there's something unexpected. The idea of ambiguity is something that Wittgenstein pointed out. There's this famous picture of the Jastrows dark rabbit, the dark rabbit figure, where we can see a duck, or we can see a rabbit. I don't want really to focus on that, because I think it's not really the point of seeing aspects. So I will keep ducks and rabbits apart. As long as the seeing aspects is approached from the direction of the ambiguous figures, we miss something. And we miss some two very basic important facts. That the first is that in the course of daily life, we come across numerous things that could be seen as this or that, but we don't take as a good enough reason to see them, and even not to articulate that. Really is the mere having of an experience, or merely being in a certain mental state, a good reason enough for giving it expression, to articulate it. So following Bath's interpretation of Wittgenstein, it matters for our understanding of aspects that we will recognize the particular way in which the seeing of aspects work in ordinary context. Moreover, it's not typical that language game of seeing aspects that we switch from an image in another in the same picture. In a certain sense, this is typical of metaphor, which creates the duality, precisely to invite the others to see aspects, to fill in the semantic distance, but not of ambiguity. Then another point is that is not clear in the dark rabbit images, that aspect seeing is embedded in a language game. We don't usually have this kind of figure. That's something we do in the laboratory, in the lab, and it's also the limits of our experiments, because aspect seeing is embedded in a language. It is just a psychological phenomenon that we can see certain drawings in this way or that. But from a philosophical point of view, what's important is that grammar has room for that phenomenon. But Red Room wasn't prepared for that, for the ambiguous figure. Aspect seeing is not an isolated experience or mental states, but one embedded in a language game where other people can play. Where there might be different aspects of an object we might want to express. And the problem with articulating them via the words this or that is that they can mean many different phenomenological objects, the meaning of which cannot be successfully shown to the other. So capturing this phenomenology, the phenomenology of the aspect change in its change in our language, was a central problem in Wittgenstein philosophy. The phenomenological language of this or that, the varying of the aspect, can be meaningful, but only when mediated, only when it is embedded in a language game. And I will provide some examples of meaningfulness when it is meaningful to talk about aspect seeing. For instance, the word never is apt and makes sense when I say, I never seen these in that way before. When I use always in, I have always seen these like that. Well, it's dubious, this use in that linguistic game, that language game. Or for instance, when you see a face and you say of a face, take for instance the Paranoia face by Salvador Dali. I have always seen it with this face. You should add what face? And as soon as you had a not that face, it's no longer if you had always done it. Or saying of a face in a picture, I've always seen it as a face, would be strange, whereas it has always been a face to me, and I have never seen it as something else. This is okay, this is art in the language game. So why the varying of the aspects belong to the language of possibility, the phenomenological language that we use to talk about the varying of the aspects? Because it refers to a continuum of experiential possibility. We can see many aspects, infinite aspects, while physical language refers just to the objects, to the discrete entities. And in Wittgenstein view, phenomenology is grammar in the sense that it provides the rules for meaningful description of our experience, but which differ from descriptions about facts. Metaphor as an invitation to aspect seeing responds to this fundamental need to articulate our experience of the world, if that experience and the world is to become ours and share. So metaphors are necessary to articulate experience. And that's the first point. That's the naming function of metaphor. What we experience is continuous, while our words belong to discrete systems and should be flexible enough. When we don't have words to articulate the aspect, seeing, experience, we can resort to metaphor to fill the gap, or use metaphor to evoke the aspect to be seen. And the way we reconstruct the aspect seen experience in language can thus be shared with others. Metaphor allows me to share my experience of seeing an aspect, leads others much nearer to our perceived experience, even though it's subjective, self-related aspect might still be untranslatable, or maybe leading to other metaphors to be expressed. So metaphors give us these means to compose in a coherent picture the experiential domains that are said to be intention, distance, unexpectedly put together. Ortony, for instance, divided this naming function of metaphor into two theses about its compactness. Metaphor is anyway a quick, concise, and effective use of words to express that aspect, to communicate that experience to others. And then the inexpressibility thesis, that metaphor is necessary to communicate what is inexpressible, what is unnameable, what is difficult to talk about in literal, the physical language in Wittgenstein's term. But both these theses highlight the important role that metaphor can play in overcoming the inarticulacy of some experience. For instance, the experience of illness, but maybe it will come later. However, Ortony's theses do not explain how metaphor can give an access to the speaker's perspective of this or that, can give an aid, but how it can give an access to this speaker perspective. So, for instance, in the case of COVID, this was the Guardian cover at the beginning of the pandemic, seeing COVID as an eclipse, the way to give a name to an experience which was unnameable. So in this way, aspects are shareable. When aspect C is embedded in the metaphorical language games, they become shareable. Instance, Arnold Bass says, the seeing of aspects, rather its expression, puts our attunement with others to the test, which means that can also provide the occasion for center moments of intimacy, depending on how far that attunement is found to reach. However, there could be aspect by people. We mentioned yesterday, people that are not able to see you, because there are two senses of see. The sense, the literal sense of see, the seeing, when I see an object, and the literal sense of see too, where I see an aspect that I was not able to see before. So I could be blind in the second sense, but not in the first one, and vice versa. With blind people, I cannot reach linguistic intimacy. The aspect blind person is someone who lacks this capacity to see something as something else. So what does exactly happen to us and between us when aspects are seen and expressed? I think that there's kind of change in the range of possibility for thinking. What is peculiar to this experience of unfamiliarity is that the dawning of the aspects make that object different or even completely new for us, and also worth articulating. The point of seeing aspects like it's being the place where we expand our experience of the ordinary and the familiar without turning our backs on it. It's not that unfamiliarity turned back to familiarity. It's the place where we strengthen our bonds with the world by renewing it, and the place where we go beyond habitual ways and establish roots without giving up on intelligibility. That's also in pragmatic as being underlined. Metaphor has metaphor, but also some other figurative language, but especially metaphor in that it's able to make us see an aspect, alter the addressee's possibility of thinking. And that's the point of a metaphor, to bring about a change in the range of the addressee's possibility of thinking. So to the extent that the expression of seeing an aspect via metaphor is an expression of experience, the others have no way of gaining access to this or that experience other than seeing the aspect via ordinary language. But what may appear to be just giving information about the objects is not used for the purpose of giving information, but it's rather for the idea, what is described as seeking of intimacy when we convey an aspect. I cannot see an aspect for you, but I can give you hints as to how you might bring yourself to see the aspect. I can invite you via metaphor to see the aspect. And there is the place that we can meet. Imagine it, I surely you have this, you think you try to look at the sky and say whether you see something else in the clouds. Children always do that, and parents try to check whether they see the same aspects. And someone could say, look, the cloud is an elephant. And I see, yes, I see the elephant in the cloud. I see the same elephant you have seen in that cloud. And in that way, I feel an intimacy. We are having the same experience. I see the same elephant in that cloud, where other people maybe cannot because they are blind with respect to the cloud as an elephant. And this is the framing function of a metaphor, how metaphor can do this, to highlight these aspects. We have to find something about that experience that makes it worth articulated. It's not every properties of the metaphor that make it worth of articulated that we want to highlight. Most of human experience are ordinary, familiar, and as unremarkable. And what we need there, the experience is not to be lost on us, not to pass us like nothing, is the ability to find something about the ordinary and the familiar that makes it worth noting, articulated. We need to be able to find it new. And this also in ordinary language. Just to quote Aristotle from the Rhetorics, ordinary words convey only what we know already, what is familiar. It is from metaphors that we can best get hold of something fresh. And this is the framing function of a metaphor, some ordinary properties that were in the background emerge and become salient, while the rest remain unremarked. But could we have the experience of intimacy with familiar metaphor? Well, there's something like the continuous aspect seeing. Well, every metaphor has a framing function, but does not guarantee that the others notice the prominent aspect to see. We must distinguish, say Wittgenstein, between the continuous seeing of an aspect and the dawning of an aspect. The picture might have been shown me, and I never have seen anything but a rabbit in it, and not the duck. So against interpretation provided, for instance, by Mullal, there's nothing like the continuous aspect seeing. It doesn't really make sense. Seeing an aspect is marked by a certain awareness, in part it's subject to the will, by an occupation with what we see as a kind of paying of attention, of care, a paying of attention. It only struck me for a few minutes and then no longer did. Ask yourself, for how long I'm struck by a thing? For how long do I find it new? So when a metaphor is so familiar that goes unnoticed and passively accepted by the other, we cannot reach linguistic intimacy. We can revitalize dead metaphors. So in conventional metaphor, we find this familiar conceptualization, while novelties come from the disruption of familiar conceptualization or unexpected conceptualization that we found in novel metaphor. But we not always need novel metaphor. Sometimes we can revitalize a conventional metaphor, making it new again, but in another context. Another example by Juman Haddad, a journalist in Die Zeit, he wrote that after the mass sexual harassment incidents occurring in Cologne during the New Year's Eve, and she revitalized some conventional metaphor, for instance, that woman is a prey and that man is a hunter. Say, instead of telling your daughter that she's a prey, tell your son that he is not a hunter. It's something that is very conventional, but in that context, in that way, she revitalized something that was conventional and overused in the community. So, drawing some conclusion, does the resolution of unfamiliarity guarantee intimacy? When the semantic distance in metaphor is filled, the metaphor becomes familiar. I can just use once a novel metaphor, then it becomes familiar. It is no more completely new and familiar. In this sense, the speaker used metaphor to solicit the other, to change her way of seeing, thus grasping a point of a metaphor to reach together. As in the case of humor, the interlocutor needs to come to the point by herself, otherwise intimacy is lost. If I try to explain, paraphrase the metaphor, or explain the jokes, I lose the intimacy, get lost with my interlocutor. Compare it with improvisation in music or in dance. There's some point where we meet. The sensibile in musica, the leading tone in music, or in tango, some figure, the point where the figure starts, but there is the figure, there is the structure where I can hear the leading tone, but there's the point where we can meet, where we can all together, we have to end up the pace together and resolve the leading tone. So at the question, what is worth articulating? Because maybe not all aspects are worth articulating, but it's the other framing function of metaphor, the affective framing function. Metaphors reveal not only what aspects, but what affective values we attribute to them in our life. And that's why there's a double framing effect. The perspective provided by the metaphorical framing guides the addressee interpretation, but also provides some evaluative connotation. When I say poverty is a disease, I'm attributing a negative evaluative connotation to poverty. And this double framing effect might crucially depends on the affective coherence between the valence we attribute to what is metaphorical described and the affective valence of the metaphorical source we use to describe it. So when the interlocutor comes to the meeting point, we have more possibility to find the addressee at the meeting point in linguistic intimacy in the case of affectively coherent metaphor. Affective incoherence makes this global processing of sense-making more difficult to be carried out, neutralizing in general metaphorical and affective framing effects. While affective incoherence improves logicality interpretation and get rid of ambiguity or the availability of the point. So the direct affective impacts come first and determines the attitudes toward what is coming next, the search style of the addressee. Affective coherent metaphor made participants more prone to read, listen, see novelties, while affective incoherent metaphor made participants more vigilant and less prone to make sense of the speaker. So to draw the conclusion, that's the way I make sense of Wittgenstein claim that the game has not only rules, but also a point. And linguistic intimacy is this effective point where we can meet when invited to see unfamiliar aspects, aspects that emerge and unfamiliar, unexpected, and become familiar when the semantic distance is failing. Metaphor is thus the invitation, but it's not metaphor per se that increase linguistic intimacy, nor familiarity per se. So both are connected to intimacy. It is our ability to feel something special and new, something extraordinary in the ordinary that puts our attunement with other people to the test. All questions and suggestions are welcome.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for this very rich talk. And as you were saying, suggestions and questions are welcome. So please feel free to ask your questions. We have 10-15 minutes time, so there's space for questions. Eric has a question, so and then Linus.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Evers. My question seems a bit off your talk, but I was wondering the whole time if you ever read something from Hans Blumberg. He's a quite famous or underdog philosopher from in the 20th century in Germany, and he's strongly inspired by phenomenology and so on. But the point I want to make, he created the method of metaphorology. As a historical method for philosophy, and the idea, for example, in books like Shipwreck with Spectator, he compares the different notions of this metaphor, but he's really looking for how the metaphor alters. Looking for Lucrez, Nietzsche, and different kind of thinkers of the ages. And his idea is to find something like a worldview behind, implicit in those metaphors. And this is his method for investigating the science, the history of thinking. And I was wondering, for me, it's a great attempt. His writings are quite complicated to read, but it's I had to think about him while listening to your talk. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. We have indeed a group in metaphor studies and translation also, because it provided a lot of insight also in translation, but more in the historical dimension. And my approach is quite different, but of course is enriched also from other perspectives. And it reminds me also this idea that there's the bedrock and the river, there's something that happens in the history. So for instance, metaphors change, and it's something that becomes conventional. They are created as has completely new, but that they, for the overuse of in a language way, in a linguistic community, they become sedimented, and they become part of that linguistic community. Sometimes they become literalized, and it's impossible to make them new, alive. For instance, daisy, the word daisy comes from day's eye, the eye of the days, because of this yellow, and then the it's kind of open eye in the day, and not the flower. It was they don't have the name for the flower, and then or for the overused, it becomes literalized, and then now it's literal. So it's a good point to talk about Bloomberg, because there's this idea that language itself, it's not that something is before literal and then metaphorical. What we have as literal start as a metaphor, and that becomes literalized, and that a lot of cases like that. And these sedimented ideas sometimes comes also from philosophy, of course, and then comes and became part of our culture, of our sedimented part of the river. there are something in the middle, this conventional metaphor that can still be revitalized in some context. So yes, it's very useful, and of course there's a lot of insights. Then my approach is quite different because I don't present it here experiments, but some part of my work is really in cognitive science, and I use then this notion also to test how speakers behave. But of course, it's really rich. There's a richness of insight in the overall group having different perspectives. Thanks a lot for your question.
Yeah, thank you for your response.
Thank you. And Linas now has a question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for a very rich talk. And yeah, so I will try to formulate my question, but yeah, let's see how it goes. So I was wondering about the metaphor, the relationship between the metaphors, intimacy, and togetherness. And so I was kind of a bit, yeah, curious about, what you said about the humorous remarks as making the two into an intimate couple. And I was thinking, okay, so, in something like, so in phenomenology of sociality, you have this idea of social acts by Reinach, where, kind of, for example, a communicative act could make the communicating persons into a group or connect them. And then I was wondering, so why would the humorous remark jump straight into intimacy rather than kind of togetherness? But then, while listening about the metaphors, I was thinking, okay, but metaphors is something that requires some common ground, and you can't really. It's kind of difficult to use the metaphors with those outside of your community or those who don't understand. So maybe it's if humorous remarks requires a metaphor, then it kind of, you can then see the jump straight into some sort of intimacy rather than to a bit more neutral togetherness. So yeah, so I was wondering whether how would the intimacy with togetherness relate, and how much of a role would the metaphors play in creating this sense of togetherness? And then also the second question is a very small one.
Can I just answer to this question, and then otherwise I'll lose the thread of thought. Yes, it's a problem indeed. Well, I have an idea on the link between metaphor and intimacy, but I'm not sure that intimacy and togetherness, there's surely a difference between intimacy and togetherness, but I'm not clear there's on how intimacy is connected to togetherness. While on the humorous remark, I think that while the metaphor we have a point, in humorous, a lot of time we don't have a point. We like to not have a point, just to, fantasies, just to having something that is incongruent, but we don't need to resolve. And that's the difference with irony. In irony, we need a point, and we need a point to address the other, and we have this critical negative attitude. In humorous, no. We are keeping together both the reading, and they are altering our possibility of thinking, because we are not erasing one reading and keeping the other. We are saying that also the other reading is possible, but without making a point. Metaphor as a point instead, I think. But on the other side, you make me think that there might be a reason to connect humor with togetherness. And maybe, but it's part of another work I'm doing that I not mention here, in ignorance. And I'm arguing that in some sense, in humor, there's some you know, in metaphors, there's a ignorance preserving trait. So in order to make something emerge, we have to ignore something else, keeping it in the background. And we need to keep this ignorance trait. And it's always, and it's kind of seems the same in the humorous remark, but we are keeping both. And it's important to, when you have a community, to keep people that ignore something, say that there is also this other reading. And that's something that keeps us together in a group. There's something of dialogical in that. So while in metaphor, we are hiding something in order to make the other emerge. In humor, we are providing both and try to keep both the interpretation. Because the other were ignored, but the point of the humor, it's not a point, but the aim of the humor is to say that also the other is relevant. It's a possibility and worth discussing in the group. So I think this might be the connection between humor and togetherness and metaphor and intimacy, even though I'm not sure that I have an answer on the connection between intimacy and togetherness. I don't know whether I answer.
Yeah, I think it was quite an open associative question. So it was really interesting to hear, the line of thinking. Yeah, that was really interesting.
The second question?
Yeah, if we have time.
Yes, I think we.
Yeah. Anyway, but maybe it's a very, very short one. So something like seeing oneself as a group member. It's also kind of, seems to also be associated with some seeing an aspect or seeing oneself in some sort of aspect of the world. So I was wondering, how, again, how relevant or how closely related the metaphors would be with, something like seeing oneself as a group member. Which is really,
but say that, for instance, we yesterday when we listened to Luna, there's this idea of being seen, and sometimes you think that you are in the group but you are not seen by the others and you feel alone. So I think there's a role in aspect seeing in a group when there are blind people, so you feel alone, you do not have this sense of togetherness, but I'm not an expert in togetherness, but you don't feel to be together with other because you don't feel that the other seeing you, not as a physical object. And I think this can be the link. Metaphor can help you in expressing this feeling. Fine. There I feel like an ant in a river. I don't know. I'm expressing how I feel there, how I see myself in that group. I don't know whether I answer, but this could be the connection.
Okay, thank you very much. And before going to the third and last speaker, we agree with Eric, so our last speaker, to have some minutes break in order to survive for the last talk. So I would say we will start again at 12:15, so in 10 minutes. Okay, perfect. So see you all soon.
Thanks a lot for all the questions.
And thanks, Professor Evers.
Thanks a lot to you all.
Hey, Linus, is it fine if I already share my screen, or should I leave it unshared?
No, I think it's fine. It's a very nice poster.
Thank you. By the way, is the audio quality okay here?
Yeah, it's perfect. I think it's
very good.
Are you at the research lab?
Yeah. I'm at Artis. It's the best solution. The archives are still closed.
Yeah. Ah.
Yeah. And at home, yeah, that's not a possible.
I don't think 3.5 hours of Saturday morning at home with the child is
would be great. By the way, Francesca, I'm seeing like 50 elephants per week. Like on there are plenty of elephants, sadly, and there is a famous German comic series for toddlers, Die Sendung mit dem Elefanten. Yeah, it's a tiny friend from the German mouse. Yeah, so it's daily business for me.
Yeah, so you have specific knowledge about that, not ignorance.
my own field, elephantology. No, I was smiling while you were talking, because exactly these clouds is some kind of comic strip inside this series. Yeah, but anyway, sorry.
Okay, I think that we can start for our last session, and with our last speaker, who is Erik Norman Vita Olsen, who is a research fellow at the University of Cologne, and whose research topics include phenomenology, psychopathology, and anthropological or philosophical anthropology. The title of his talk is On Familiarity, Togetherness, and Selbstverständlichkeit in Dementia Disease. So thanks, Erik, for being here, and please.
Yeah, thank you, Simone, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy have the opportunity talking to you. When I share now my slides, you will see I altered the title. Yeah, one could say heavily, but as I mentioned Aristotle, I shaped it down to the morphe I wanted to talk about. So this is really yeah, it's a true title of my talk, On Orientation, Familiarity, and Trust in Dementia Diseases, a Live World Account. And so I was wondering that I guess no one used the word trust before. So let's see where it goes. So my talk has like 5 compartments. First, I really briefly address what dementia diseases are. By the way, I have my long-term research project is on the phenology of dementia diseases. So it's my habilitation project in German logics. Then second question, why phenomenology of the life world to address dementia diseases? Third part, I come to the core, like the systematic core, on disorientation, movement, and unfamiliarity. Fourth part on disorientation, language, and mistrust. And fifth part, like a therapeutic perspective on pointing. So, what are dementia diseases? As I said, a really brief introduction. As you might know, dementia diseases is some kind of umbrella term for different kinds of types, like Alzheimer's as the most prominent, but there are vascular reasons for having a dementia, Lewy body dementia is a different type, and so on, and so on. There's a doubling of the probability, like every 5 years from 65 years onwards, so it's heavily age-related. there's exactly because of this, there is an increasing rate worldwide, like 50 million right now, estimated 82 million in 2030, and around 150 million in 2050. You never know, but this is the statistics, right? Obviously, there's a huge dominance of the naturalistic paradigm. Right now, I would say it will last the biochemical age. It will be the biochemical age. So brain mapping in physiological terms, it's not gone, but it's not more. It's now more precise. It's precise by biochemical methods. One general definition of the world most influential classification system, DSM-5 for psychiatric diseases, psychic diseases, I quote, Alzheimer's disease is Alzheimer's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative condition. It is one of the most common forms of dementia, a group of symptoms that lead to a decline in mental function severe enough to disrupt daily life. Alzheimer's disease causes problems with a person's memory and ability to learn, reason, make judgments, communicate, and carry out daily activities. And as you see, I highlighted here 3 things like neurodegenerative, daily life, and communication. So, but my point is that the main paradigm remains focusing on neurodegenerative processes, and the daily life and communication. Yeah, obviously there are scientific disciplines focusing on that, but the mainstream really remains naturalistic. And this is so I come to this second question. This is why phenomenology of the life world makes sense. To give you, to make it, sum it up, dementia diseases are not only neurodegenerative diseases of the brain, but psycho and socio-degenerative illnesses of a person in its social environment. And I quote Carell here for the differentiation between disease in objective terms and illness as felt experience, right? And Stephen Sabat, a really famous scholar who tries to give some social constructivist ideas on dementia diseases, writes in the foreword to Lisa Snyder's book to how Alzheimer's is felt. Until now, 2 very important considerations are virtually ignored: the inner life of the person diagnosed and the social situation in which the person lives. Yeah. And for me, it's obvious, that there has to be some applications of the phenomenology of life world in a sense of structural psychopathology. And what is structural psychopathology? Stangeleni describes it as the idea of grasping the underlying characteristic modification that keeps the symptoms meaningfully interconnected. So it's a holistic approach to what specific types of dementia diseases are experienced by the sufferers and the social environment. And yeah, really brief some general remarks on my reading on the philosophy of life world. There is obviously a late stage of the life world concept, which is the most known surrounding the crisis of the European science and so on in the 30s, like Husserl's late philosophy. But it was a topic of my dissertation to show that there is an early version of the phenomenology of life world called The Constitution of the Spiritual World in the Ideas 2. They are written in between 1912 and 1918. Already Emanuele Caminato was mentioned. He was focusing parallel to me, or a bit earlier to me, in Cologne on this section of the Ideas 2 from Husserl. Obviously, we have to differentiate between the life worlds in a plural sense, like the experienced historio-social cultural plurality we are living in. And each philosophy or phenomenology of life world has to start. Like this kind of plurality is always the starting point, even for philosophical endeavors. It's an important point of Husserl's considerations. But as you might know, Husserl really tries to give something like a universal theory of the structures of every life world. Like he's a universalistic thinker, and I think it's a transcendental account on what the life world is for every person in the world. So, and I do make a shortcut. I had here a lot of slides concerning the concept of the life world, but I wanted to drive by a shortcut and focus on the connection between life world, familiarity, and trust with Thomas Fuchs, because this is how my connection from orientation on the one side and language and on the other, and mistrust and disorientation is popping in. Fuchs offers a developmental interpretation of the Husserlian Urdoxa, like the general pre-givenness of every experience, including norms, not just the givenness of mere objects, but of values, norms, the language we speak, and so on. I explained it while commenting Sonja's talk tomorrow. And he gives a notion to Wittgenstein's bedrock certainties in the light of Erikson's Urvertrauen, like basic trust. And his concept is like a developmental concept. He terms it in a stoicistic words as oikoiosis. He means or he describes the reciprocal process between child and primary caregivers by which the child enters what Husserl terms homeworld. So the difference between homeworld and alien world as some polar structure of the life world itself is quite important for today's talk. And yeah, he's summing up, and this is for me the most important thing on how connect the dimensions I want to connect. Fuchs is saying familiarity with the world and trust in others are equally originative, gleich ursprünglich, and inseparable foundations of the life world. So both aspects of my today's talks are in a developmental perspective, interwoven, intertwined, necessarily intertwined. And so this is my today's framework. I ask, how are orientation, familiarity, and trust connected? How is the loss of orientation in Alzheimer's dementia, I focus here, related to movement and linguistic abilities? How are these alterations connect to unfamiliarity and mistrust, as well as to phenomena like stigmatization, isolation, anxiety, despair, depression, violence, and so on? And how to tackle those alterations therapeutically. And I think it's much on the plate for 20 minutes, but I guess, or 25 minutes, but I guess it will work. But first, some sip of tea. And give you a chance to reread what we're gonna chase for today. So, on this disorientation, movement, and unfamiliarity, there's some heuristic differentiation I would like to make between the everyday loss of orientation and the pathological loss of orientation. I mean, these are heuristic categories, right? On the one side, the everyday loss could be described as a partial and episodic experience, which concerns only a section of our life world or an episode. So, for example, if even if you have a really stressful and dangerous situation, for example, you're doing a hike tour in the mountains and a thunderstorm is coming up, even then you have you fear for your life. It will be restored like the status before, and I bracket out here the case of trauma, which for sure is it's close to a pathological loss of orientation, because It affects the experience of the life world as such. Sorry for the twist here. And it's a permanent alteration of the ability to loss. So if you have anxieties, permanent anxieties, it's a permanent alteration of the way you perceive, for example, heights, or choose what you want, right? And to give you a brief description of the loss of orientation, sorry, the slides are a bit working not well today, but here is a nice quote from Bea, quoted in Snyder, the book I mentioned already. One day, I was driving into town to get my hair done. I should have turned left, but I just kept driving straight into oncoming traffic. A policeman waved me to the side of the road, and I told him I didn't know how it could have happened. I had used this road so many times before and never had any problems. It was strange and very scary. I could have hurt others. That was the first time I realized something was wrong. I haven't driven a car myself since. So to sum up here, or to interpret this quotation, there's on the one side a sudden loss of orientation. So Bea never experienced that before. And there's a good chance for confusion, like strong emotions, like confusion, insecurity, anxiety, and Bea was also mentioning worries for the people around her. And it's potentially traumatizing, so it alters their behavior. Maybe she stays at home right now, or as she says, she will never drive a car again. But on the other side, there's this progressive loss of the ability to orientate. And this is quite important with regard to this transcendental notion of orientation in Husserl's life world theory, like places, times, people are mixed up, confused, forgotten. So here's a three-dimensional loss. I call this like the three dimensions of orientation with Husserl, like spatiality, sociality, temporality. Plus, there's a disruption of familiarity as a basic character of the home world, as Fuchs, as quoted in Fuchs before. I also wanted to mention the embodied side of this. There's a decreased perceptual ability connected to disorientation, like vision, hearing, and quite important proprioception, like the way your body is felt in space. And so it's not surprising that you have an increased risk of accidental falling in a progression of dementia diseases. And obviously you have a reduced everyday competence. I mean, I'm focusing here on orientation, but if you keep in mind that it's about memory and other symptoms, it's really obvious that a lot of everyday tasks will become heavy. So, and I would term them with an eye on the Husserlian I can, like the experience of the I cannot. For example, planning and organizing gets tricky quite early. It's a nice indicator for having severe symptoms close to dementia diseases, like doing your finances, contracts, holidays. But the daily task and the progression of the type of dementia disease, like dressing, cooking, eating, are becoming quite heavy to master. And typically, like this searching and forgetting topic leads to a lot of conflicts and frustration. And so the relation to the primary caregiver becomes really a foundation of the sociality of the persons affected, but at the same time it's under fire all the time. And here a good quotation to elucidate from René van Neer. He wrote a book. He's affected by dementia, Alzheimer's, together with his daughter, searching, and his daughter is paraphrasing this, searching for the toilet for hours, resistant when he wants to go shopping, not being allowed outside alone, secretly kept bills, his unclear housing situations, the countless burglary attempts, The television he can no longer operate. He can no longer make coffee. So all dimensions I was describing before are I think perfectly quoted here, like the disorientation, the frustration, the paranoia. So there are no burglaries. He's paranoid, and the problems with the daily chores. But there's a specific phenomena I want to focus right now on, and it's the urge to move. So the statistics, it's about, I'm looking for better ones, but these are the only ones I know because it's estimated. Approximately 60% of persons affected with dementia run away or get lost. If you're stressed, lost, desperate, and scared. And if you ask them if they still can talk, most of the time they tell you they want to go home and where they feel secure, sheltered, safe, right? And now I want to show you that it's in utopian, but at least comprehensible desire. So again, a quotation from Arno Geiger, a literate. When he said, he talks about his father with Eddie, he was going home. This intention was in fact not directed against the place he wanted to get away from, but against the situation in which he felt foreign and unhappy. What was meant was the illness, and he took that with him everywhere, even to his parents' house. With the illness, he took the impossibility to feeling sheltered with him on the soles of his feet. So, and especially this metaphor on the soles of his feet really is interesting for the way Husserl terms movement in his life world writings in the late 30s. I will come back to that. But as Arno Geiger sums up in I would say affective terms, he interprets the situation of the father as a deep homelessness of a human being to whom the whole world had become alien. So the father being in his home world is right now in an alien world. He can't be at home, so to speak. He's lost in exile, and the book is titled An Old King in His Exile. When the darkness falls, fear sets in. Then the father wanders around helplessly and restlessly like an old king in his exile. Then everything he sees is frightening, everything wavering, unstable, threatened to dissolve in the next moment. And nothing feels like home. And for me, it's perfectly matches with Fuchs' notion of the atmosphere of unease, menace, or even uncanniness when the dimension of basic trust is altered. And this is affecting not just present, but even the future experiencing a lot. And I would say the affective core of our home world, this feeling home, dissolves or is heavily altered. And I announced it's an utopian desire, but why comprehensible? And here I'm reading Husserl a lot. Yeah. So for Husserl, movement is a basic mode of orientation. It opens up a horizon of possible orientations, and it's a practice of access. It's a bad translation for Zugangspraxis. You see the bodily metaphor in here, like the body moving practically through space and yeah, opening up horizons of possible orientations. And then here the German word spazieren is a nice indication. It stems from the Italian word spaziare, to explore space. I hope I'm right here, because here are linguistic experts around, and it's obvious, but movement is necessary for searching and finding. Yeah, if you are looking for a thing, you're running through the through your flat, for example, then maybe stop a second, think about where you maybe lost the stuff, and then start running again, but maybe more focused. And in Husserlian terms, it's allowed about the connection of kinesthetic perception, affectivity, and practice. So these dimensions are merged together. And Fuchs has a nice example, because he stresses the structural connection between habit and inhabit. Like he's giving the example of your parents' house. When you are moved to study or so, and coming back to your parents' house, your body know where the light switch are. Your body feels, but at the same time it gets affected. Yeah, you experience the things from your childhood. You start playing and looking around, and some mood will hit you necessarily. Yeah. So, and movement on the more psychological side is a embodied source of self-confidence. So what Husserl terms the I can in the paragraph 59 of the Ideas 2, the feeling that I can move. Yeah, and this is why it fosters self-efficacy and self-regulations as two major concepts from Bandura. So, and it's obvious. You would suggest movement therapy and, for example, create some kind of circular designs in care institution when there is a urge to move, typical for these persons. And so here is some design from. Sorry for the German titles, but it's really a progressive account, and it's heavily criticized because it resembles like the Foucauldian idea of putting the people with dementia outside of the communities. But what I want to stress here is that the architecture is done in the light of the alteration of the way people with dementia experience their world. So you have in the middle part the circular design, and the people can't really get lost. And maybe it's pervert for you, but there are bus stations where no bus is coming. So the people sit down, take their while, sit for half an hour, and then go home. Otherwise, I experienced by myself, demented persons are just leaving their care institutions, running through the streets, and the whole sense of space is altered. So they are really in danger to get hit by a car, and they get lost really on a daily basis. But let me focus now on the second thematic section on disorientation, language, and mistrust. I see I have to hurry a bit, but I think we will manage. Yeah, obviously there is a heavy loss of language, especially in Alzheimer's dementia. It occurs, almost 100%. I mean, this rate is obviously connected that alteration of language is the social environment gets it quite fast. I mean, you can have strategies to cover these losses, but in the progression of the disease, it will get obvious. And it's really an enormous challenge for communication and interaction. There are several phenomena typical connected, I would say, mostly to this communication issue, like stigmatization, social isolation, the loss of long-term relationships. And it's I would love to stress this point more, like stigmatization, but it's maybe for the discussion. Obviously, it affects speech production and comprehension, like both sides. I will explain right now. And semantics and pragmatics are significantly impaired. So the way, the vocabulary we have to describe the world, and the way we use language. And there's a really interesting notion on indexical expressions. So because what I want to show right now, sorry for the German, by the way, we orientate ourselves in a three-dimensional manner by indexical expressions. You have here like this color code. In the middle, you have the pronouns like I here, I, you, we, there, and so on. In green, you have the spatial dimension the temporal dimension before and later. And in blue, we have the spatial dimension there, and you could think of left and right, above and under and below, and so on. All these words are, what we do with them is to orientate ourselves in the world and within the social world in a three-dimensional manner in temporal, spatial, and social dimensions. And exactly this ability is lost to a specific degree. Like it's called in the literature positioning from researchers. And this is why I use both words here, like orientation and positioning by the language, by indexicals is massively affected. It shows in studies that indexicals are used more often, but are less well understood. Here, a nice quotation from Christine Bryden, suffering from AD. A real difficulty in speaking is words like we, they, I, you, he. When I have to work out who's doing what, that to whom. And a really interesting study for our leading topic. There's less success in referring to a permanent social unit, such a partnership, by the use of the pronoun we, like Hüden and Nilsson used this positioning theorem to show exactly this. And to give some short but strong interpretation on this, to sum it up, I would say the ability to, together with Michaela Sommer, the ability to mentally transcend the current situation and integrates contextual information about space, time, and sociality. And it's exactly this is shown by the well-known and often used mini-mental state test. It asks for spatial and temporal orientation mainly, but I suggest you should add a personal dimension. Who are you? When were you born? And so on. And the point here is that there's a really strong connection between orientation and language. It's a three-dimensional notion of orientation, and especially this contextual knowledge about places, times, and persons is affected most. Yeah, how to meet these findings? Since, I'm coming to the end, I'm summing up a bit. Since familiarity and trust are preconditions of togetherness, I would say so, are significantly affected by dementia diseases, and general expressivity, this is Husserl, is a precondition for empathy, respective sociality. You can look it up there. We have to detect alternative resources. And exactly this is a phenomenological approach is doing right now. For example, Pierre Contos, Thomas Fuchs, and Christian Teves, like this embodiment approach, embracing the lived body's pre-reflective, expressive, situated, and habitual character. And you could think of music, dance, theater, painting, and so on. And maybe you know some documentation or YouTube videos, quite famous ones, about exactly the connection of body memory and dance, for example. Beatrice Döttlinger, she's focusing on mimic gesture and icons in care institutions. And Jan Sontag is looking, or he's emphasizing a sharpened sense for affective atmospheres in persons with dementia. But my suggestion is, it's a combination of everything I'm talking about today. But my suggestion is pointing as a therapeutic paradigm. And these are the last slides, but I want to make sure that, it connects quite well to the talks before, especially from Professor Salmela. So we have this orientation function of nonverbal pointing. And why is it helpful? Not just for orientation, but for togetherness, for familiarity and trust. So let's start. It's multimodal. Yeah, it can accompany verbal language, and it's performed by facial expressions, gestures, posture, and intonation, and so forth. And these are termed synsomatic cues from Karl Bühler, for example, gaze alteration, to synchronize attentionality. I will come back to that. And it can make emotions accessible. Quite important point, like think of the mimical display. It's situated, like nonverbal pointing is situated. It orientates us in the sphere of proximity, a Husserlian term. The origo, a Bühler term, the I here now center of relative orientation is preserved even in a late stage, like this 3 dimensions of orientation, like a minimal situated orientation, I here now, it's preserved, it's well documented empirically. Yeah, nonverbal pointing is all the time practiced. For example, it happens in specific situations like eating, sleeping, dressing, and so on. And so it activates the situational body memory. It's a Fuchs term, right? And it's so you see it's connects to habitualization. It's a synchronizing way. So it enables joint attention, a really big topic in cognitive science. It supports shared intentionality. So you see, enabled supports. I'm not saying it's a guarantee for that, but it's really helpful. Again, in Husserlian language, it helps us sharing an intersubjective horizon and maybe entering a community of understanding. This would be the goal of each communication. And like Samina pictured quite well, it supports our ability to share emotions. Last 3 slides, because I wanted to give another concrete example. You can imagine nonverbal pointing in gaming, art, design, and architecture. So for example, arrows, paths, light, and I skip to the next slide because this is exactly an example. It's a point-and-click virtual reality visualization of the city all the people in early stages of dementia were born in. So it's a homeworld from the 60s. It's Krefeld in like economical bloom, and they have to point and click to go to the cinema, to see the cars and so on. And they orientate a lot, so they practice their body orientation, and they point and click all the time. And sometimes they point with their fingers because they are so immersed, right? And so this is a summing up slide. My suggestion for the overall topic of the conference is that we have a nonverbal pointing and nonverbal access to we-ness in the sense of a we can experience. We have there an alternative resource for group identification. What Husserl calls communal spirit as a highest sphere of the spiritual world of the ideas too. It preserves, or it helps to preserve selfhood and personhood in this positioning sense of Sabat and Tare. So we can address the different kind of narratives a person wants to be addressed, and not just the stigmatization as an AD sufferer or so. And so my conclusion would be it helps fostering trust, familiarity, and togetherness. But yeah, this is maybe, it sounds like a phrase, or only together. So yeah, it's a joint thing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much for this highly interesting talk and very rich. We have 10 minutes for discussion. So please ask your questions. I see that Lucy has a question already. So Lucy, please.
Thanks so much, Eric. This may be a question, or it may be a reading recommendation, depending on what the answer to the question is. I really, really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I guess I wanted to ask you how you thought your concept of orientation intersect with Sarah Ahmed's discussion of orientation, which, if you don't have a thought on, would be a recommendation to go and read Ahmed, because I guess I see in her work more emphasis on notions of how we experience objects and actions as near or reachable, which is a slightly different emphasis from, and maybe it was just because of the talk format, but that felt more like a finding one's way emphasis on orientation. So that's where I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the connection between those. If not, Sarah Ahmed's great as a recommendation to read more about a slightly different take on orientation.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. Yeah, I should reread a few papers I already read, but I think it's a lot more outside of relevance. And maybe to give a quick notion, what's yeah, the state of my endeavor, so to speak. With Husserl, I really start from like a transcendental idea of orientation when it's in this three-dimensional sense, like intertwinement of spatiality, temporality, and sociality. But Husserl offers a much more concrete descriptions, and there's a split of home world, alien world, but you have to put in regard like language, nation, and so on. So there is a much more concrete layer, and I think it's really smart to use Ahmed for like political or sexual orientations, religious orientations. And I think it's really important because maybe you could match easier like the diversity of the individuals with Alzheimer's much better. And this is an open task for me, but it's a perfect recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I also wondered if there was something about being in that category of people meant you were orientated by others as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Erica. I see that Linus has a question, so I give him the word.
Thanks, Eric. That was really interesting. So I had a couple of questions. So maybe kind of more asking to elaborate or clarify what you said. Could you say a bit more about pointing as what was it? Pointing as helping or making emotions more accessible? So you know how specifically that works, and then regarding the problem that the Alzheimer's patients have with the we indexicals, or using the indexicals as we. So is the problem that they kind of fail to integrate different, the intentional backgrounds or content, and rather, fuse, as you said, just conflate the different spheres? Or is it about forgetting, or, so how exactly that works? And then, yeah, if we have time, I would come back with the further question.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start with the second question. Obviously, what I wanted to stress that there is like two sides of indexical expressivity. Like the one, you can indicate deficits on the linguistical level, and you can indicate resources on the non-verbal level. So this is my idea in the background. Maybe it wasn't so clear at all. But yeah, as you suggest, I term it, if you want to suggest some kind of ordering principle behind the symptoms and the connection of the loss of disorientation and language together, my account would be to say, yeah, there is some kind of what I termed occasional horizon, like the ability to integrate the knowledge we gain throughout our lives, but in the abstract knowledge like a declarative knowledge. We're not able anymore to integrate these information into the actual situation, and because it's thought in this three-dimensional pattern, it comes to exactly what you said, not just forgetting but confusing and twisting. So imagine yourself being in a care institution. You woke up there in a white coat, and obviously and maybe you have amnesia, or you forget where you were the days before because of a head injury or your psychological state. Then you are looking for cues where you are at. Maybe if you have still the linguistic abilities, you can easily ask, but if not, you have to make sense of it on your own. Yeah, and so you have to combine information, and so it's from the outside it seems a lot like confusing, but it's an attempt to create like narratives where informations are lost, right? So, and this sharing emotion aspect on nonverbal pointing. To be honest, it's an open task, but on the one side, you should look at this multimodal character. So you can point by the voice in intonation, yes. So when it accompanies a gesture, and I say there, and I do it really enthusiastically, it's much easier to and plus people with dementia are even in the late stages open and still capable for emotional feelings. So there is the sense for affectivity and emotions is quite well preserved. They maybe get the emotion I display easier than if I describe it verbally. So and yeah, obviously the mimics, but we can display and point with our face, right? There are cultures who point with their lips, and yeah, the gaze is strong. Again, in attentional terms, it's obvious that the position of our body, when I'm talking like this, it feels not comfortable to you. My body has to turn, and the gaze has to turn to your face, and these are really, I would say, in phenomenological tradition, under-researched parts of embodiment. So a lot of phenomenologists are talking about embodiment, and yeah, they overseeing a lot of details in non-verbal expressions. This would be a point I want to make. Yeah, maybe this was 2 answers.
Thanks, Eric. Francesca has a question as well, so I invite Francesca to ask her question.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your talk. Make me think that I was interested in self-illness ambiguities, this difficulty to distinguish what is mine and what is to be attributed to the illness. This kind of ambiguity that people can experience, where it's not that it's something mine which is not familiar to me, and it's something we can experience in case of mental disease. And I was wondering whether there's something like that in dementia disease, and whether it can be solved through pointing, a kind of disorientation where I cannot keep track of what is mine and what is to be attributed to the disease. And I need some pointing in order to keep track of what is mine and what is other.
Yeah, and there's a notion, finally, in Minkowski, an early notion that people of this group, empirically, it's totally unclear how the group size was, that they're referring a lot more regular to here and now, and Summer interprets it like it seems that they try to make transparent to themselves that they are here right now. So it's some kind of security, a self self-regulation for security and so on. But I'm not so sure about the quality. But what Sabat and Hare are trying since the 90s is great work. Because they make pretty clear it's a social question, right? And these self-illness ambiguities, I mean, these are obvious questions for therapeutic intervention. If we have like anxiety disorders, and I can't say anymore, who am I? And I don't find a good question, and I'm feeling sad about this state. It's obvious it's a really important sign of therapeutic intervention, and I think I'm talking about this because still this therapeutic tools are used too less. And yeah, especially to having a lively society surrounding people with dementia is about reducing stigma and seeing more the people behind. I mean, it's a attempt that is there in discussions since 30 years, but I think out of personal experience, it's obvious that it still works in this stigmatization pattern, and so the persons are lost behind, and their multiple selves are lost. And the authors I'm mentioning are using indexical expressions to indicate in their conversations how to extrapolate the different kinds of selves. So, not a short answer.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Erica. Lucy had another question, and then Santiago. Or Lucy, yes.
I was going to ask about stigma, so Eric actually already gave some insight into that, so I'll leave my question.
Okay, perfect. So, Santiago, please, you can ask
thank
the
you.
question.
So thanks, Eric, for your presentation. It's been a pleasure to listen to you again. My question has to do with space, because as you made your presentation, I came up with the idea trying to, while bringing together everything with this presentation together with familiarity, and I thought about this particular and very characteristic phenomena of dementia diseases, which is this general atmosphere of the alien and of menace and distrust. If it's not, or the disruption also, which is the reversal or the counterpart of this, a disruption of the sense of familiarity, which is the relation it has with space, in the sense of can we think of space as something or as a dimension of experience which has a foundational role regarding the sense of familiarity, and can we regard familiarity in this sense as a result of the phenomenon of space, which, while being effective in the case of demential diseases, then shows secondarily a phenomenon in the affective dimension, in the disruption of familiarity. Because I thought, so, and I thought of two different guidelines for backing this hypothesis. Firstly, that we can maybe illuminate this foundational role of space to affective dimension, for example, in the case of kids, because in the development of children, what we see is that the exploration of space comes first, and then other differentiations like the familiar and the infamiliar, what it is me and what is not me, come after. And in fact, there are also some studies showing that in the case of blind children, these differentiations come after. So they last a bit more to be developed, as if there would be a certain kind of facilitating factor in space and in the access to space and in space experience, which promotes these differentiations. And the second guideline to this was, okay, we can think maybe that the alterations in Alzheimer's disease are so deep because of how primary the basic factor which is concerned and affected here it is, which is with space. So it is as primary then, and therefore it has therefore it is that the Alzheimer's disease has such a big concern or encompassing dimension of experience. And thirdly, there are certain treatments which are very interesting, which are being developed in Canada and in Argentina, which are about tango and dancing together, but tango particularly, and how and it's being applied for Alzheimer's disease, and which are being tested before treatment and retested after the treatment, and they show significant changes in the corporeal scheme of persons doing this, and secondarily different manifestations regarding how the sense of orientation is improved and this sense of trust, which would be also some backupping information or experiences in favor of this basic this basic foundational role of space to this pathology.
Okay, so I will give you a short answer. Especially this example of tango. If you ask for a hierarchy of these three dimensions, I don't want to give you to say I don't agree in prioritization of space. I would say, for example, this tango example shows this intertwinement of sociality, spatiality, and temporality. And when you think longer and deeper about this example, you see all dimensions are popping up. And so it's for me sometimes when you look at childhood, it's sometimes elucidating, but I guess for dementia, it's a wrong perspective, right? There's a strong analogy and a metaphor, and I think this metaphor is wrong, like dementia as a reversion of this process, because we are persons right now, and the perspective is super different. So becoming a child and going to die or having a disease is a super different experiential perspective. And so first I would say, okay, we have to make sure we won't forget about this disorder. And this is exactly why I wouldn't agree on giving some kind of priority to the spatial dimension, especially because grown adults, I would guess, are heavily relying on symbolic social conventionalized patterns. But the interesting part is that if you are referring to spatial design, you could integrate these kind of habitual patterns, for example, by having an individualized design for your bedroom, for example, for your shelves, having a design from the time when the people were young, and using objects with its implicit affordance as some kind of windows into their into the times they have good feelings with or they born into, so, and they are much more familiar with. And this is I know it's not perfectly matching your questions, but at least it's an interesting point for designing institutions in a way. So I experienced like this horrible standard home for the elderly with dark corridors, heated corridors. You smell piss when you enter. Sorry for that. And the opposite, like a really nice, light, circular structure where it's easy to orientate, to get rest, to listen to music, because the spatial environment was designed super differently. Yeah, but it's just an anecdote. Thank you.
Thanks. So we have now 20 minutes more, and I will open a discussion with reference to each of the speaks we heard today and eventually also yesterday. So just open questions session. Of course, you are not forced to. Lucy has a question. So.
Sorry, Eric, it's another one for you. I was wondering if you had at all looked at discussions in, say, deaf communities when interacting with people for instance, don't use sign language or something, whether there are discussions about shared experience and joint attention and orientation in those communities. That this is from a huge place of ignorance. But I was wondering if that might be some useful resources in there.
Yeah, a colleague of mine is working in exact this area, but she's translating the diagnostic tool from English, from the British English into the German for sign language. But we had some discussions and some open questions we discussed. One was, is this group with more stable with regard to their communication, because it relies more on embodied resources? And our intuition would be yes, but there is no data. There is no studies at all. And especially, it's a funny thing. It's just a short comment. For me, it's super obvious that you have to focus on nonverbal communication for this group, but the studies are, it's totally understudied. You would guess there is plenty of rooms due to the declarative symbolic losses, but no, it's really an understudied field.
Well, fantastic question though. If you two could go and research that, that's just wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Linus?
Yeah, I just wanted still a small question to Eric. So with the pointing therapy, and the pointing as helpful tool to reconnect with the others, how would so how strong can it be? How strong of a togetherness can it build? So is it just kind of the more of a, you mean the more of a situational connection, maintaining the connection, or could it also kind of build into some more substantial or lasting habitual relationship, and give rise to a new set of new kind of familiarity?
Yeah, I thought about this in preparing this talk, but it fell over, and I hoped we could discuss, because I think it's really interesting question. My suggestion would be, we have to alter our expectations for togetherness. So if we are looking for stabilizing communicative units, yeah, okay, we can do a lot for the circumstances, right? But this expectations, especially connected to recognition, when family members say, oh, she or he doesn't recognize me anymore. Maybe it's true on the first glance, but if you have a further look, maybe it's due to the state in that right moment. So there's a possibility of lacking attention. Or there's a possibility, okay, she does recognize me, but she can't express it pretty well. This is typically the case, that expressive abilities are, not meeting the expectations of the community anymore. And so there are a lot of possibilities. My suggestion would be to lower the expectations, but it has some implications for what communication is at all. For example, having a conversation about an ongoing topic, and when the discussion partner is dropping out of this topic, and you have to be tolerant on this to keep the at least the interaction running. It's stressing for most people, and so it's typical that a lot of people from the community are dropping contacts. So it's an indirect answer to your question, but I think it's really too much as an aim to aim for long-lasting units could be explained in words. Yeah, this is not possible, or at least really seldomly happening.
So just a clarificatory. So when you say we should lower the expectations, now it seems like for both things. So on the one hand, for the expectations, what the pointing therapy could achieve, and improve the state of the person, and then on the other hand, just in this daily relationships with the dementia person, to not expect, and that they will understand you as a healthy person. Yeah.
Well, it's not really a paradox. I would say you have to make sure that the circumstances for communications are as good as they can, but the concrete realization of communication can be total out of your expectational scope. So it can be super depressing because there is no communication at all when the other is not attending. And this is so, as I said, the circumstances. This is my research goal, to make sure that the circumstances are met, and then actual communication, it's up to the persons in the situation. You can't regulate it, so to speak.
Any further questions or suggestions, remarks?
Yeah, if no one's in the queue, I would like to ask a question to Sonia, and also possibly then to Professor Dokic. So to Sonia, so the one was, if you could say a bit more about the possibility of epistemic feelings as being embodied feelings. You mentioned it briefly.
Yeah.
And then there was this your discussion about seeing the boyfriend at the office, or about this transition from unfamiliar to familiar. And then I was thinking of a similar situation in the case of when thinking about the sense or feeling of togetherness. And I had this example or case where where you meet, you live abroad, and then you go back to your home country and meet the friends or the family that you can miss a lot, and then you see them, and obviously you feel good, you feel happy, and then the question was whether it's actually the feeling of togetherness that feels good, and or is it just the reconnection or meeting them again, and coming back from the isolation from them. So yeah, and then I guess the point would be that is this positive sense of feeling or affect is just an accidentally there, or is it really then part of the familiarity or togetherness? And then the question, I guess, to you and then to Professor Dokic, given your really fine-grained and complex analysis of the senses of familiarity or feelings of the familiarity, do you think how much do you think, or to what extent do you think we could extend this one to, or this could apply to the sense of feeling of togetherness as well? Because I mean, I don't know. Yeah. There seem to be some similarities between them, but yeah. So maybe you have some intuitions.
Okay, thank you, Linus. I'll just start trying to answer your questions. So the first one was about the definition of embodied epistemic feelings in general. This is not my thesis, but there's a very nice paper from Arango Munoz from 2019, sorry. And he practically says that he bases actually his arguments on the tip of the tongue feeling, which was also mentioned by Jérôme yesterday. So the feeling that you can reach something, you can recall a concept or a word or a name, but you don't know how to a certain extent, or you really don't get it. And he expresses this kind of feeling as having also a bodily response. So it's something you can really physically perceive. So they are not, of course, exclusively embodied. So they're not something that you can, like the Empfindungen, so like really the things you can feel on your skin, but there is also a sort of bodily response. And I think it's also very good connected to some automatic actions we do, like putting our mouth close to, our hand close to our mouth when we try to recall something, or closing our eyes to concentrate better. So they also have, of course, a body response. So in this sense, epistemic feeling can be understood to be embodied in a certain way. So they have also a sort of connection with the way we behave and our body response. And the second question about living abroad, yeah, Francesca just, I think, had to go. Maybe she's gone. She wrote me that she's, oh no, Francesca is still here. Okay, no, because you're in the office, sorry.
We have 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, because you're in the office right now. So your example is a very nice one. And I think the point here is that the feeling that arises in this experience is strictly connected to the fact that I was living abroad and then I come back home. So it's like I come again back in a familiar environment after being away for a while. And this kind of environment, in this experience, it's not familiar anymore in the way it was before. So it gets a new level of familiarity, and it's like when you observe things from another perspective. And this feeling good, this feeling of warmth, I think it's not very much connected to the feeling of togetherness. I would say more that is connected to the feeling of belonging. And that could also be a good question, to what extent familiarity, togetherness, and belonging are connected. Because I see there is a slight difference between togetherness and belonging. We could organize another workshop on those topics if you want. We can just go on discussing on those themes. So I think it is much more connected to the feeling of belonging rather than to the feeling of togetherness, as, for example, also Mikko depicted it yesterday, in my view. But it's really strictly interconnected to it. So, but it's much more to the belonging, I think, rather than to the togetherness. And then your third question, which is also for Jérôme, do you mean that if we can apply the same fine-grained classification to the feeling of togetherness? So you are trying to, because we talked about actually familiarity and the different kinds of familiarity, but it seems that the feeling of togetherness, it's kind of difficult to define in different ways. So, but this is of course also a multi-layered concept, I think, and it could be interesting if you want to do further research on this topic, to observe the different nuances of the feeling of togetherness as well, because I think it's radically different in dyadic or triadic interaction, in group interaction, or something like this. So I'm not sure if we can apply the same differentiations or the same classifications we made, but I don't know if Jérôme has another answer for it.
No, I agree with you. Also, I was wondering, it's a different issue, but whether, I mean, there are, I don't know, grades in feelings of togetherness. I mean, for instance, if you take the sociological theory of acquaintance circles, I mean, that we are acquainted with people within a circle, but then there are several circles, of course. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the authors who discussed this. So I was wondering whether there are, different types of feelings of togetherness. I mean, is it the same feeling when you have it with respect to a member of your family, or when you have it with respect to a colleague of yours, and so on and so forth? I mean, so Miko told us about the nature of the feeling of togetherness, but in his account, it seemed to be, a single type of feeling of togetherness. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, his account does not allow for there being grades or degrees of feelings of togetherness, and it's not an objection. But I was wondering whether we might. I don't know, either posit several types of togetherness that can be felt differentially, maybe, or degrees of within a type. I don't know, actually. It's, probably there are degrees of familiarity, so we haven't talked much about that, but that's also an issue I'm interested in. I mean, is there a single type of feeling of familiarity, or I mean, can you feel more familiar with someone than with someone else? Probably yes, but it's not easy to analyze this gradual phenomenon, if it is a gradual phenomenon.
Yeah, it's for sure very complex. Yeah. But I mean, it's fine. We don't have to come up with answers. It's good also if we have further topics to work on for our, yeah. So I think it's good that we have reached those points, those critical points.
Yeah, no, so I guess what I meant was more of, I guess, of intuition. So in the collective intentionality debate, very often, or at least in this contemporary phenomenological collective intentionality debate, very often the talk about togetherness is in terms of feelings, but then it's clear that there is this behavioral or actional aspect to it, and then cognitive aspect to it. So it's not always that you feel this togetherness, that it's implicit, and that it's kind of you just act almost automatically, in this kind of group member mode or team reasoner mode. And in general, this talk of feeling of togetherness, it sometimes seems to be quite vague in a sense. It seems that feeling is quite elusive or hard to catch. And so then, your discussion about or this idea of that, for example, perhaps there's no feeling of familiarity, but rather than, it's lack of familiarity. And then, that kind of rang a bell to me, or connected to this perhaps idea or the phenomena that, you kind of realize some kind of connection with the other, or togetherness with the other when the other is lost, or when you're lonely, that kind of thing. But when it's kind of in the process, it's not as salient, the togetherness. So yeah, and because of that, I thought that there seemed to be quite the discussion of familiarity seemed to have quite a bit of the resources, interesting resources to go deeper into the feeling or the sense of togetherness as well.
Yeah, I think the pandemic also gave us a good occasion to discuss about it. I mean, the bodily isolation just gave us a much more strong feeling of togetherness, but because it was actually the lack of being together in social encounter, I think that arose this kind of also necessity to be together and to feel together. I mean, I think I had much more contacts with people during quarantine than in normal life. Of course, virtuals, as Lucy showed us yesterday, but I think it would be a good point to analyze the relationship between lack of familiarity, lack of togetherness, and the kind of yeah. Or, I mean, they can be observed on the same level. I think it's very interesting, actually. Yeah.
Eric maybe has a further question or remark, or
yeah. It's just popping up because Francesca asked for self-illness ambiguity, and while Linus and Sonia, were discussing, I sensed or thought ambiguity is a nice category, because a lot of social units I have been a member to, from time to time, for me it was typical to feel ambiguous about my own state, like in a self-evaluatory sense, but even in a felt sense. And I think ambiguity is a phenomena or an option in the middle of strong affirmation and no familiarity. And maybe it's interesting for the publications just to think about. It's just a suggestion, but yeah, it just pops up and it makes sense for me.
But would you mean the ambiguity between the, you know, togetherness, not togetherness, or ambiguity as
a category of social experience, right? And it's strongly connected to familiarity and togetherness. I mean, it's obvious when you mention your family. Families can be horrible, and they could be lovely, maybe at the same time. And your role on, I mean, it's a part of my home world, alien world reflection, because for sure, what is home world for me can be really resistant and exclusive for others. And we had this topic yesterday in Luna addressing racism, discrimination, and I'm coming from a really rural region, and it's really white conservative farmers who aren't really into the picture I'm living.
okay. Are there any further question? I think we have time for one last question if you have it. Otherwise, we can just close our workshop.
If I could
just briefly, Francesca had to go. Yeah.
Hello, goodbye to everybody. Thanks a lot for this beautiful experience. I learned a lot from all of you, and really I have a lot to think about in the next days, because I even have too much to ask a question. But anyway, I have to go, because otherwise they close me for the rest of the weekend here. And so I cannot come to Padua the next time. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the hospitality and to be together.
Thank you, Francesca.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice
Thanks
weekend.
a lot to you all.
Yeah, so I had a quick question to, I don't know whether quick, but to Lucy. So, and specifically about familiar, or, you know, what role the familiarity with the medium could play in the social interactions online. And specifically, so what triggered this was, I think you were saying something that those opposing you would sometimes say that, you know, you see the pixels and that's somehow
No, I would
maybe
say that like I don't think very many people argue that they do in fact see the pixels. I was just saying that that seemed like one of the alternatives for saying that I don't actually see you. It's either seeing an image or seeing the pixels, and the image.
Okay.
But yeah, I can definitely speak to that familiarity point, but I think I cut you off.
So anyway, so then I misunderstood you, but the one example that popped into my mind, it's kind of, I guess it's more of an anecdote, or at least I don't have the full justification for the, how real that was. But just I remember the first screening of the Lumiere brothers film, where the train was approaching, and so that was kind of the first screening of a movie, and people were not familiar with the medium. And what happened when, or at least the anecdote goes that way. So when they saw the train approaching, everyone just ran away from the cinema.
In lots of ways, that's like the best example for me arguing that we don't see the image. So I need to like work that in more concretely into my work to prove a better point
so that's
I don't think it's the equivalent of like Husserlian image consciousness, which is a paper I'm currently writing on at the moment.
But anyway, so then I was thinking of, so perhaps the opposition to this empathy or togetherness online, or immediacy of that, could come with the awareness of the medium itself, or
Yeah, no, I think that's a really lovely point. So I've got a couple of responses, I guess. We'll start with familiarity. So I think there's different ways we can think about familiarity there being really important. So the one is what I was calling practical familiarity, just like knowing how to use the technology in the first place seems to be really important. And I think we need to be careful not just to make a distinction between people who are comfortable with tech and people who aren't, but also between platforms. That I might be extremely knowledgeable about how to use Zoom, but maybe I don't know, I don't use TikTok, or I don't use Instagram, or I don't use WhatsApp. And while I may be very proficient in some areas and very familiar in some areas, I won't be so familiar in others. And I certainly think that that's an important thing to think about. I think then the second layer of familiarity, if we're presupposing that someone has kind of the practical know-how, how to actually use the technology, is links into the discussion that I think I had with Francesca yesterday about like conventions and etiquette on various spaces. So I think I gave the example that my dad puts full stops at the end of his sentences. And even though I know he's not being terse, and I am familiar with him using that form of expression, but the convention that sort of suffuses most of my instant messaging is a very like a deliberate way of like, not like explicit, but like that's what I would use to like indicate annoyance. And so I think we then have familiarity about conventions and culture and social norms, which again isn't any different from talking about familiarity offline than online, but obviously those norms might be different. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work still to be done about different norms and different etiquettes. And again, it'll probably change per different platforms. And then I'm sure lots of people have experiences of different forms of online etiquette with different people to, maintain multiple threads of conversation, for instance, at the same time. So I think that there's a lot more discussion there. And I just wanted to finish with like a final point to that is one of the papers that I'm thinking about writing is kind of a joke on like learning to talk again, is that kids have to learn these things in the offline world. And I think there might be a sense in which, we learn online, but I think often the idea that we have to learn new things online makes people want to say, well, therefore it's really different from what's going offline, forgetting that they've actually been indoctrinated and learned and been shaped by their social environments. So I think there might be a really lovely paper to write there about like development, just in the context of online development, which I think would have loads of links with these notions of familiarity and know-how again.
Thanks. So I think we are at the end of our workshop. So thank you to all the speakers and to all the people who have participated to this workshop and enriched the workshop with comments, remarks, and so on. I don't know if Linas and Sonia would like to say something to close as a closing words for the workshop.
Yeah, just thank you very much. It was, I mean, it was amazing to hear. It's such a shame we couldn't meet on in person, but I think it's also very nice that we could run this event online because we had the chance to meet people from all around the world. I'm just reading the message that Soli Park sent us from Korea. So I think that in those cases, online events can be very a potential tool to build new networks. So I'm happy that we had this chance to discuss those topics with all of you. Thanks a lot for everything. I think it was amazing. So I hope you enjoyed the talks as well. And thank you, Linus. Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Andrea, for being here as well. And so nothing.
And of
Thanks
course,
a lot.
thank you to Sonia as well.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So I think we are free.
Yes, enjoy
Thanks
your
again.
weekend.
And have a nice weekend.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.
All right. Yeah, I think
Okay.
maybe it's not.
Yes, we can stop.